Made to Kill. By Zekamp. Chapter 71 Interlude, Recovery. Mireille stared at her shaking hands, willing them to calm. And they did, just for a moment, long enough for her to do one quick stitch, connecting another torn bit of Fayette's muscle together. Marie, who was holding the still unconscious Maid in her lap, quivered a bit at the sight, but Olivia, standing next to Mireille, stayed calm. The doctor let a drop of healing potion fall onto the spot, and the bits fused together. Mireille removed the thread, and then Olivia finished the job with a larger dose of potion on the spot. The gaping wound healed one bit more. Only, quite a bit more to go. So, they moved to the next bit, and Mireille's hands were shaking again. It felt like the sun was making her hot and sweaty, but the wind across the clearing was making her cold and shivering at the same time. Damn this! It's just blood. Just blood. Fayette's blood. That visual certainly didn't help her at all, and the shaking got worse. The seamstress grew angrier and more unsteady until Olivia put an icy hand on her shoulder. Focus. And Mireille did. Her hand calmed. She managed another stitch, using her skills and delicate spider silk to make sure the connection was flawless and that the potion would heal things right. Hurry up over there! One of the Lord's men bellowed, and Mireille cursed under her breath. She spared 1 second to glance over at the Lord, who was holding a salve-laced fabric to his own wound, sitting a bit away from them with his own group. Olivia had administered the salve so he would have time to wait, which was part of the deal. But Fayette first. Still, it wasn't the sight of the Lord that really soured Mireille's thoughts, but rather what lay beside him. Armor. Gleaming, magic-enhanced, metallic armor, which had made most of Fayette's strikes meaningless. And she turned back, looking at her friend, so much frilier now, collapsed like that. Wearing only a maid's uniform. Sure, she had a skill to enhance it, but if that failed, then what? Mireille had made this particular uniform herself, even tried to reinforce it some, and seeing how easily the Lord had cut through it was a bitter pill to swallow. Almost as bitter as Olivia's. The Lord really hadn't liked eating one, which at least made her feel a bit better. Another stitch, another drop of potion, and more healing. Marie was staring, eyes red, as if willing them to go faster. But she kept quiet, letting the two do their work. And Mireille's thoughts ran on. Armor, that was what they were really missing. None of their party were the type to really don a suit of metal, but frail dresses were hardly sufficient. Even if they were reinforced a bit here and there. Mireille's own clothing had been taken the furthest, with bits of leather padding being hidden here and there, all over. Especially on the bosom. She had added that bit in after Marie joined them, just so the contrast wouldn't be as bad when they stood side by side. But leather was leather, and she couldn't really work that well with it, and besides, Fayette had refused to have any added to her own uniform. Went against the maid code or something. Idiocy. But Mireille thought of the spider sleeping in her pack, growing rapidly. Starting to produce thread. More stitches done, more potion, and the progress in the operation sped up. Mireille noticed her stitching had grown calm and consistent, hands no longer shaking. Planning and thinking things over always did that. It made her feel in control. Even if the plans rarely worked out well in practice. Which means I need to think things further. How can I improve this? Was spider silk alone enough to jump the gap? She remembered how the Lord's armor had reacted to Fayette's blow, a magic gem absorbing the impact. The work of an artificer. She had learned a bit from Marie about how those things worked. You didn't need magic of your own, just the right monster cores and a lot of experimentation. So, could I do that too? What kind of class would I need for it? How would it work together with her new spider companion? Her hands were now a blur, stitching with confidence as if they were working from a precise design. A design Mireille could almost see in her head. In her thinking, you had to approach a class like you would approach assembling an outfit. You needed little bits and pieces, things that would not necessarily fit together when separate, but when put together, they had a theme forming something cohesive. In this case, those bits and pieces were all the achievements she had made so far in her adventure. But they had led to the wrong theme so far, the uncommon class they had first offered her. A makeshift seamstress. Not sturdy enough for her. What theme could she craft? Spider silk, beaver monkey pelts, fighting with her tools, everything else, that was what she had now. And although she did not have the chance yet, she wanted the potential for more. Artificer type stuff. Monster cores. What did all those things share? What did she need to make it cohesive, to make sure she would be offered the appropriate class on her next level? Then, as she pulled the last stitch on the wound together, repairing the skin to how it should be, she finally found her answer, and her hands moved firm and sure. A hunter, that was what she had become. And the theme, it would be using materials that she had gathered, hunted, or she thought of her spider captured. As long as I do it myself, it should fit in. It felt right. And the potential felt like it was there. A class born from such a theme, the potential would only be limited by what she could gather. She stood up from Fayette, moving back, and let the doctor handle the rest of it, closing her eyes to focus. It would take some research before she could do anything with monster cores, proper magic stuff, but a class like that would hold the potential. And she was working in the right direction now, she only needed a few more nudges. And her outfit, her theme, would be complete. Great work stitching up that nasty wound. Progress towards next level, 70%. The sound jolted her back to reality, and her expression soured once more. Only a 15% increase from last time, despite this being her first real attempt at something like this, and the stakes being high. Trying to level a common class in the uncommon realm really is unfair. Mireille stared at Fayette, still unconscious in Marie's arms, and for a moment, let herself feel jealous. About the experience, of course, not whatever else was going on between the two. Just how much did she get from that ordeal? Again a leveling opportunity with the lady. I just bet she's going to gloat about a new level when she wakes up. But then she saw Marie's eyes, still dripping with tears, and looking at the maid with more emotion than Mireille could imagine, and she calmed. Because maybe Fayette did deserve the levels. But still, Mireille did worry. Because Fayette was not like her, planning things in advance. She didn't worry about carefully assembling a proper theme before heading forward. And Fayette might be headed toward a somewhat concerning theme. She tried to judge the sleeping form, imagine what the maid really thought of everything that had happened so far. Because talking with her wasn't as easy as it used to be these days. What did Fayette really want to become? Did she think about that at all? It had been a slow shift, and Mireille had barely noticed it, but Fayette talked a lot less about herself these days. The way she looked at things was different. Something had subtly changed, and she couldn't quite put a finger on it. But Mireille let herself look at the lady's sincere face one more time, remembering how their last encounter with bandits had gone. Maybe this wasn't her problem to solve. She shook her head, then turned to Olivia, who was busy readying her tools for round 2. Right, let's go do the Lord. Marie was still in quite a bit of shock, holding Fayette's head in her lap, blinking out tears. Of course she was. Her eyes kept going to that spot where a sword had pierced through flesh, releasing a tide of blood. All for her sake. There was no wound there anymore, the potion had dealt with that, but the crimson had burned into her eyes a bit. She could still imagine it there. Please, be fine, won't you? For my sake. It took only a moment, or maybe it was an eternity, but finally, Fayette stirred in her arms, groaning and blinking. Marie shifted position, helping the maid up to a semi-sitting position. She wasn't saying anything yet, just staring around, looking confused. Weak. It was the first time Marie had ever seen any weakness in her, really. The maid had always seemed so implacable, as if nothing in the world could shake her. It was odd, but the weirdest thing of all for her was Fayette's hair, which was now all messed up and tangled, far from the neat bundle she usually kept it in. As Fayette slowly stirred awake, Marie's hands found themselves idly combing through that hair, straightening it out, and the lady really couldn't deny the tingles it sent to her heart any longer. All of this, the sight of Fayette walking forward to confront the Lord, the bloody duel, it was just too much. She had to admit it. This was more than just a passing crush. Quite a bit more. Fayette's head bent back, and she looked up, eyes finally focusing on the moment. They met Marie's and she gave a wan smile. Oh, I didn't bleed out. Nice. Marie couldn't stop herself from letting out a giggle at that, but halfway it turned into a sob, and she bent her head down, evading those eyes. Dummy. I told you not to risk things like that. Well, too late for that now. You'll have to accept it. I do what I want. Fayette answered, trying to lift herself up to her feet, coughing. She got up for just a second, then wobbled, and fell right back down, back into Marie's lap. The impact stung a bit, but not that much. There were better things to focus on. Fayette tried to wiggle back up, so the lady took hold of her hand, keeping her in place. Hey, no moving about yet. Doctor's orders. Fayette glared forward, not at Olivia, but at the Lord who was just starting his own treatment. I swear if he's still using that stupid slippery ground skill. Marie poked her in the nape. You're just weak, keep down for a bit. Just a bit more. Not just because the girl really needed it, but this felt nice too. A bit of calm after all that. Positions reversed a bit, supporting the maid in turn when she herself had been supported so much. Fayette kept staring at the man. And eventually spoke, quietly, just for her. I didn't really expect it to be that tough, honestly. The other times were just so much simpler. But one-on-one like that, it's just so different. I think he could have killed me. Marie went back to combing through her hair, and spoke in a whisper, making sure it carried with her skills. But he didn't, you won. You did great. Fayette looked up and met her eyes again, and grimaced. But this wasn't a real fight. I was weaker than I thought. Haven't been taking things seriously enough, I think. If I had lost. Marie blocked her mouth off with a finger. But you didn't. It's over. Is it really? Fayette asked, quietly, looking back at the Lord. He's just one guy. Not even a proper fighter, I think, more of a leader type, and I got handled. There are so many more out there. And finally, the Lord noticed the gazes coming his way, and looked up from his surgery. And he smiled. As if he didn't have a gaping hole in his shoulder. No, he just leisurely raised his other hand in a wave and nodded at them. Skill carried his voice over to them. A fine fight, you have spirit, miss. I really was serious before, if you want to come work FO. Olivia suddenly stopped administering the potion and prodded a finger at the now half-open wound, and the Lord winced, quieting instantly. The doctor's voice had an edge to it. Remember our deal. You swore on your honor as a lord to let these things go, you're not coming after us anymore. I can smash this potion into the ground if you feel opposed. The guards standing by his sides tensed, and Mireille looked around carefully, crouched by the man as she was. But the Lord waved his men down, face regretful. No. I am a man of my word. I just thought that as she had just woke up. Go to hell, Fayette shouted, then coughed, and fell back against Marie's bosom. The Lord grimaced, then looked up at Marie, apologetic. Then I apologize. But I do accept my defeat here. I'll get rid of my side of the marriage contract. Can't do much about your family though. Olivia suddenly stared into the air for a moment, grimacing, then poked the Lord again, face returning to its calm. Stop moving your hands. But Marie didn't hear Olivia's words really, nor watch the operation proceed. Because, with that declaration, a weight suddenly left Marie's chest, a weight she hadn't even realized she was still carrying. A marriage that had been looming so long, just gone. Just like that. She looked down, and couldn't help herself from tearing up a bit. Fayette really had kept her promise, about beating off any challengers. Marie laughed for a moment, looking at the riverside clearing they were still in. The sky felt so much bluer now. And with that weight gone, something else flooded into its place, and her heartbeat quickened, and Marie suddenly realized she really was hugging Fayette against her chest. It felt like every inch of contact was suddenly burning hot. Marie gulped. Yes, she really couldn't deny this much longer. But... She looked down at Fayette, who was now watching Mireille work, oblivious of what Marie was feeling. The lady felt paralyzed by indecision. What should I do about this? Feeling emotions was easy, but actually doing something about them. She could still remember the first time. She had been more girl than woman at the time, giggling as she listened to a rather talkative young maid gossip about other families. Then they came to the subject of boys, and she had realized that she felt different. Very different. And she had told the maid so, and she had received a push forward from her. Support. The courage to go tell that one pretty girl who came over to visit every now and then that she rather liked her, in more than the normal way. Big mistake. That friendship never did recover, did it? And then, much later, eventually after Mother just kept hinting and asking after her interests. She had told her too. That none of the prospective suitors interested her. Nor would they ever. Bigger mistake. Mother was very clear about what was appropriate to be known in public. Marriage arrangements got rushed forward quite a bit after that one. And so, as she looked at Fayette, again combing through her hair, Marie bit her lip. hesitated, and slowly pulled her hand back. More hesitation. It was just so difficult. It had taken a lot of effort from her to get Fayette to open up, even this much. And they were a maid and a lady, and she knew Fayette felt odd about that. And they were girls. That was maybe the biggest obstacle. Because, for just a moment, Marie let herself frown at Fayette's back, trying to pierce through that head and peer directly into the mind within. Because the maid wasn't responding to any of the hints she kept dropping. You have to know, right? Right? Is it even possible? Especially just now. That rule I quoted for the duel, to grant the boon. The favor of a lady, it's practically a direct confession. You read stories, right? You have to have understood that. But Fayette remained as implacable as ever. And so, Marie hesitated, because she just wasn't sure, and it was too risky. But she couldn't really fool herself. Isn't this just another excuse? To put things off? To not have to face them right now? Right now, her heart roiling, it felt like too weak of an excuse. She really wanted to say something. But she could not. Need a stronger excuse. Could she find one? And then Olivia was walking back over, and Marie was pulled out of her thoughts, back to reality. She looked, and saw that the Lord and his men were already gathering their gear, and starting to walk off. A relief, to see the man finally gone, for good hopefully. But she still tensed. Because the doctor certainly wasn't smiling. The gloomy woman pointed a single finger at Fayette, looming ominously. You. Fayette looked down at her apron, still rather stained, then looked back up. Me. Olivia advanced a step. Yes, you. You used some doses of healing potions back at the mines, right? Fayette nodded slowly. Well, yes. Had to after the whole explosion thing. Is something wrong? With the amount you had to use today, you're nearing the limit. And we're heading toward a magical plague. Olivia looked up, nodding at Marie. A body can only tolerate a certain amount of magic in a certain amount of time, as you should well know with your training. Marie gasped. Is she risking mutations? Olivia shook her head. Not yet, but it's getting there. Slowly. So. She pointed her finger back at Fayette. For the next 5 weeks, no more healing potions. Fayette grimaced at that, but then nodded behind her, at Marie. Together, with the lady supporting her, they both got back up onto their feet. Fayette didn't wobble. Carefully, she let go of Marie's hands, and stood there, trying to look confident. Okay. I guess I'll have to be more careful then. She shrugged. Olivia frowned, looking at Fayette's not very steady footing. Darnation. Guess we're not moving today. Think you can move tomorrow? The maid rolled her shoulders around, then flexed her arms. Marie stared as hints of muscle showed against her sleeves, realized what she was doing, then turned her eyes back up. I think I'll be fine. Just need some sleep. It's not a long walk there, right? Only a day or so from here, Olivia answered, then sighed. No helping it, then let's see if we can find a place to stay for the night. Maid took the moment to step in, finished with winding up her threads from the Lord's operation. She nodded towards the town. There's only one in here, and the Lord's men were saying that they were leaving right away. Should be plenty of space for us. Fayette nodded at her. Lead the way then. Maid started walking back, and Fayette took a step to follow. And then stumbled. And Marie caught her, supporting her by the shoulder. She smiled up at the frustrated-looking maid. Hey, just for today, let someone support you for a change, all right? Fayette grimaced, but didn't push away the help. Fine, guess there's no helping it. Together, they took a step forward. And Marie realized that just this much was nice too. Having something to dream about made the day seem a lot brighter. Yes, for now, this would do. They were heading off to a dangerous situation anyway, it wouldn't do good to upset team balance with any strange talk right now. This should be a good, working excuse. She could wait. So, anxiety gone, her step felt lighter. As they walked through the thicket, Marie couldn't help her eyes from always returning to the moody maid by her side. Peeking glances here and there. She couldn't quite keep the grin off her face either. Hey, how about I try cooking for you for a change? Maybe that would be enough of a hint. Fayette just looked exasperated at that, turning to her. You, cooking? Why, with how messy you keep things, I can't even imagine." And so they walked off, ready to rest after a long day, mood brightening with every step. But not everyone went. Not quite yet. They didn't notice it, preoccupied with the hero of the hour as they were, but only 3 were walking back to town. Olivia had let herself fade into the shadows, waiting for the others to get far off enough. Because she needed a moment, just for herself. Once the clearing was empty, the doctor finally let her skills end, and appeared back into sight, sure that nobody could see her. Her face bore no smile. For a moment, she let her eyes follow the river, still passing flowing along languidly by the clearing, and finally focused on the bridge just a bit ahead. Then she followed the road from there, all the way to the horizon where it faded past a hill, just out of sight. She imagined the city beyond there, waiting. A thunderhead passed by her face, and she sneered, gritting her teeth, and threw the black pill she had been holding onto the ground with all the force she could. She wanted to, but she didn't shout or curse, so she just stomped onto the pill until it was crushed to dust. Had to be discreet. Then she stopped, and breathed heavily for a dozen seconds, and slowly, calmed her face again. Olivia looked down, grimaced at the remains of the pill smashed into the muddy ground, then bent down to gather it all back. Because the contents could not risk discovery. It took her a moment to gather it all, but by the time she was done, her face had returned to its normal, gloomy countenance. And then she started making her way back to town, cursing the Lord for delaying them one more day, and cursing him for one other thing too. Yes, Mireille had not quite gotten enough experience for a new level, but Olivia had. Not just a level, but a new skill too. But, tucking the pill away into the deep pockets of her jacket, she muttered one last curse. Another one gone. Just like that. Damnation. Because unlike the others, whenever her class decided to grant her a new skill, she never celebrated it. Chapter 72 Quarantine. The day after the duel, Fayette's body ached all over. Still, they were moving along fast, quickly approaching their target. Olivia was moving as if she was possessed, stomping along the road with her eyes never leaving the horizon. Mireille walked more calmly beside her, and Marie and Fayette brought the rear. As she walked, Fayette held her broom in front with both hands, staring at it. She held it like a sword, trying to imagine herself as a knight on the training grounds. It bobbed side to side just a hint with each of her steps, but she tried to keep it steady, unmoving. She held her breath. The broom kept bobbing side to side. She let out her breath, then finally sagged, letting the broom clatter to the ground, dragging behind her. That really doesn't feel like training. How do those knights do it? Yes, they were very close to their target now, only a few bends of the road away from the coast of the Middle Sea, but Fayette's mind wasn't on that. She didn't really see the autumn forest around her, nor the birds flitting about above. She was still thinking of her duel, stewing in dissatisfaction. And more than that, disappointment. Because she hadn't really been training seriously. And her bones still ached from the consequences. She hadn't ever seriously tried to train herself at something, and now she was having trouble thinking of how to do it. Fayette had always had a natural knack for a maid's work. She had been cleaning around the orphanage as long as she remembered after all. So, getting the class and getting to work had felt like a very natural thing, just doing what she had already been doing, gradually getting better at it. Fighting had been similar. When that first kobold had burst through the window in front of her, it was like some hidden instincts had kicked in, letting her have a chance in the battle. And she had been good at it. Very good in fact. Quite a few dead people could attest to that, and Fayette reckoned that many of them had done more training than she ever had. Of course, she gradually got better as she did things more, but that was learning from experience, somewhat different from actual training. Because with training, your only objective was getting better. She always had other objectives, even if they were only levels. So, how did you actually get better at something, when you had been trusting your instincts and levels for so long? For a moment, Fayette focused on her maid martial arts, letting the knowledge granted to her by the skill guide her for a moment. She felt her steps grow more balanced and her poise grow firmer. But that was something granted by a skill, not something she had really learned. And it wasn't just straight-up battle skills, Fayette had a hint of magic in her too now. Except she didn't have a natural talent for that. And consequently, her progress had been stagnating. She closed her eyes for a step and focused on that ever-present link, connecting her to the bucket that Mireille was taking a turn carrying. The slime within stirred a hint as Fayette drew in a touch of magic, then settled as Fayette let go. The maid held the magic in her grasp for a moment, then opened her eyes, aiming a finger forward. A tingle passed along her skin as the magic transferred towards the finger, then turned into a cool drizzle of water. It splashed forward, quite limp, very pointedly, not strong. Because she just didn't have the knack or a strong power source. And she hadn't been training. Her face drawn to a frown, Fayette let the magic fade, then turned to the side, looking at Marie. The lady tended to stay rather close to her these days, so Fayette had gotten used to her presence nearby, a rather comforting thing. Right now the blonde woman was keeping pace with her, somehow still managing to sketch into a notebook as she walked. Fayette took a step to the side, just so she could peer within for a moment. She saw Marie's sketch, a cute doodle of their slime sneaking up on the lord. A hint of a smile tugged away the frown from Fayette's face. Just in time for Marie to turn and meet her eyes. "Oh, you like the drawing?" Fayette nodded, taking a step closer so they were side by side. "It is fitting. If only the real one had doodly eyes like that." Marie giggled softly, then tucked the notebook into her pouch. "Are you done contemplating the way of the broom?" "No, I'm not sure I'm making much progress really." Fayette looked at the forest line next to the road for a moment, thinking. "Say, doesn't your family have knights and people like that? How do they train?" "Well, yes we do. I have some passing familiarity with their training. I can tell you what I know." Fayette gave a small, grateful bow. "Thanks. I really don't think just repeating broom swings under a waterfall is going to cut it for me." Marie gave her a strange look, then shook her head. "A waterfall? Why would you? Never mind." "Well, repetitions do have their place, but it depends on the type of training really." "Type of training?" "Yes, there are different methods for different outcomes. I suppose, the most basic type would be foundational training." Fayette gave a doubtful look. "Let me guess, that's the one where you do lots of repetitions." Marie nodded. "Yes. Basic work on honing one's body and instincts. Sparring with opponents, running laps, repeating basic techniques until they turn into instincts, that type of thing." Fayette nodded. "Sparring would be good, but none of you are really a good opponent for me. As to the rest," she flexed her left arm for a moment, and examined how her definition showed against the fabric. "I think I'm increasing my strength well enough." Right," Marie said, staring at the arm for a moment, then turning away. "Well, that all gives a good foundation for skills. If you have a skill that doubles your strength, increasing that baseline will have big results. Then there's of course skill training, for trying to get upgrades and such." That sparked Fayette's interest. "Skill training?" Marie nodded, then began using a hint of magic to lift a pebble from the ground in front of her. "The most basic type is to get more used to your current skills. For example, trying to do things first without the skill, then with the skill, then trying to integrate the two." As she spoke, the pebble wobbled in the air a bit, and Fayette could almost see it whenever the lady moved from using a skill to not. "So, I could try to use Maid martial arts without using the skill?" she asked. "Well, something of the sort. It differs a lot," Marie said, still focusing on the pebble in front. Then she lifted it up to her eye level, and with a flash of magic, threw the stone off into the sky. Fayette followed its arc as it flew to the forest, wondering where it would land. "That looked like it could hurt." "A simple stone can do quite a bit," Marie said, agreeing. "However, that skill, stone spear, is still a bit limiting, as it only helps me do that one thing with my magic. What if I wanted to change that skill to something else? Is that where the other skill training types come in?" "Yes. Generally speaking, there are 3 main ways to change a skill, though 2 of them need you to have an uncommon class." Fayette frowned, realizing why she hadn't ever had a proper talk like this before. "I don't think any of the caretakers at the orphanage had uncommon classes, and at the manor, it was only a few of the people." "Mireille, have you heard of any of this?" The seamstress, who was walking a bit ahead of her, turned around and shook her head, showing that she had been listening attentively. "Nope. But I figured it was something of the sort. I think we've all leveled quite fast, and never had the opportunity for this sort of talk. Can you take this bucket back?" Fayette stepped forward and accepted the bucket, hung it from her broom, then swung it behind her, supporting the broom against her shoulder. "How about you, Olivia?" The doctor looked back and nodded, then turned right back forward. "My old teacher did speak of it. Guess she's not in the mood for a long talk." Marie's face was thoughtful. I never figured this type of thing wasn't common knowledge. Fayette sighed. Maybe in cities or something, but well, only common sorts out in where we're from. Anyway, what were those last few methods? Well, the first one, I wouldn't really call it training, more like detraining. You know how if someone has a skill at rank 1 and doesn't use it that much for a while, it can become something else. That one I have heard of, Fayette said, thoughtful. It's a common wisdom that you should put 1 point into skills you want to keep. Exactly, but it also works in the other way. Make it intentional. Stop using a skill you aren't too enthusiastic about, then hope it becomes something more useful. Fayette ran through her mental list of skills. I have cutlery control, disarming smile and dry laundry at rank 1, but I have still been using them. Do I want to keep them? As she thought over it, she realized she had quite a bit of fondness for cutlery control, but not so much for the other two. I guess I should put a point into cutlery control just in case. The other two, dry laundry, has been rather useful, but disarming smile, not so much. Maybe I should hold off more on using it. It felt a bit wasteful to intentionally not use a skill she had, but if it could lead to a side grade that was more useful, it might be worth the risk. I'll have to think more about it. Finished with her pondering, Fayette turned back to Marie. I think I have some ideas from that. What were the other things? Marie once more started channeling magic, gathering a new pebble in front of her. Fayette found it oddly thrilling to follow how the lines of magic ran along the curves of her skin, all the way to her fingers. How much do I have to train to get that good? Now, there are two main ways I could try to train this skill for a rarity upgrade, Marie said, lips pursed in concentration. The first method would be just working on the skill as is, trying to make it stronger. That's generally what unlocks a straightforward power upgrade. Fayette nodded, thinking of her sweep dust. She had had the skill on rank 5 for a while now but hadn't yet unlocked any upgrades for it, despite having the class for it. I guess I should just keep using it more if I want something straightforward. And the other method? She asked. Marie launched the pebble into the air, straight above. What is she? Fayette began to push her out of its way, eyes wide, but Marie motioned her down with a hand, then caught the pebble again with her magic before it could land. Relax. It wasn't going to quite hit me anyway. Fayette huffed. Don't make me worry like that. For some reason, her complaint made Marie brighten, almost hum. Sorry then. But anyway, the point is to try and do something different. If you try to push your skill into a new direction or do things that could lead it elsewhere, you can get an upgrade that changes it quite a bit. The maid nodded in thought. Sounds similar to what happened with my maid's poise and cleaning tool proficiency, which ended up changing to maid martial arts. I wonder what else I could combine like that. She had spicy cooking at rank 3, and unseen attendant at rank 5, which were both high-tier contenders. I think I want to keep these two as powerful options, but I wonder whether something straightforward would be better than something different. Fayette turned back to Marie, who was now juggling the rock in the air. Do general skills count? The lady nodded. Yes, they can end up becoming class skills in many ways. Always an interesting case when it happens. With that, Marie let the rock fall down, satisfied with her demonstration. Does that give you enough food for thought? I think it does, thanks for the lesson, Fayette said, returning to her thoughts. A good time to think over these things. She was now past the level 20 capstone, so the next thing to wait for would be her next class upgrade at level 30. Everything I do before that will matter. And I really need to get a rare class. Leveling already feels a bit slower than it was before, and I won't always have new things to do. She looked back to the side and saw that Marie had gone back to drawing. It made Fayette a bit envious. Marie had no class or general skills for drawing, not anymore, but she still managed to do quite well with it. Just hard work and effort. I want to get good at something too, not just rely on skills and instinct. But, how do I train to become a better combat maid? It was a tough question, and though she had no answers quite yet, she had some leads to pursue. But such things would have to wait a moment because a hunter had their duty. With Fayette deep in thought, their party finally crested the final hill and saw the middle ocean spread out before them. Fayette and Mireille both gasped at the sight, stunned at the ocean larger than anything they had seen before. A seemingly endless expanse of blue with rolling waves all over it was breathtaking. Mare smiled, seeing the childish wonder on Fayette's face because true smiles were so difficult to pull out of the maid. She committed it to memory and promised herself to sketch it before the day was done. Only Olivia was looking at what was right at the border of sea and land, a city built on an array of islands. Truly there were hundreds of islands there, but they were grouped into clusters so that only 6 main groupings could be made out. The city of Bienvenus. A city under quarantine. Now, it wasn't actually the whole of the city that was on quarantine, just one of the 6 island groupings. Life went on in the other ones as long as you didn't get too close to the border. And that was what made it eerie. Fayette and her party had crossed the Great Bridge into the city and been greeted with a subdued mood. There were vendors and civilians about, but the atmosphere was tense. Windows were closed. Talk was hushed, and gazes were suspicious. More people were leaving the city than entering. So they walked past empty plazas, and idle canals, seeing grand cathedrals and giant markets that now stood quiet. Rather picturesque, but haunting. Like a city in steady vigil, bearing silent witness to tragedy. And as they walked deeper inside, nearer to the quarantine zone, more people started to appear on the roads. Not civilians though, but guards, soldiers, and of course, hunters. Many had answered the call and come here to help, whether it was for money or duty. Many of the hunters were already wearing the plague masks given out by the officials, even if the infected zone was a ways away. Caution paid in this profession. Fayette squinted at the beak-like masks, as she walked past them, then channeled just a hint of mana, and saw the gleaming patterns drawn into them light up. Monster cores inside those beaks, I guess. And the type? Well, it went without saying. Only as they found themselves by the very border, staring at that grouping of islands just 1,000 feet out, with no boats entering or leaving, did Fayette truly understand what a magical plague meant. Because she could see into the other islands, just barely. Here next to her, there were soldiers and other armed people, and further back there had been civilians. But the island in front, she saw neither. Only shambling figures, moving slowly. She could imagine their groans on the wind. Dead men walking. Or near dead, reduced to a beast-like intellect. Some called them zombies, but there were many kinds. And then there were also the living who had chosen sin. The infected. Fayette shivered, then turned to Olivia, who was also staring at the eerie islands, eyes dark. Can you explain this again, Olivia? The doctor nodded, then pointed at one of the distant figures. That is why you are not allowed to drink more healing potions right now. She lifted up her other hand, showing one finger raised. There are 3 main ways mana affects people, and animals too for that matter. The first one is relatively harmless. A small background dosage, gradual and restrained. Like what was going on in Pelagni. Causes a bit of sickness as the body fights the influence off, and eventually gains resistance to it. Humans are more resistant than animals generally. Olivia lifted up a second finger. Next is the more dire case, when a bigger dose is received all at once. Like what happened to your friend Elise back then. A big dosage, which can cause minor mutations if untreated, and a bit of acute shock at first. With a proper recovery and no additional doses, things can return to normal. A third finger went up. The third case is when things go bad. Either a long-term dosage of lots of mana, or a shorter dosage of a gigantic amount. More common for careless mages, or fools who try to gain magic by eating artifacts or such. She finally turned to her captivated audience, who shivered under those eyes. That is when true monsterification happens, and you stop being human. Best case it's only minor and you still count for the system, becoming something like the damned elves. Worst case you become a raging beast with no levels, no different from other monsters. Fayette frowned. Then how does a plague factor into this? Olivia chuckled darkly. Sometimes you get really unlucky, and the poor sod who got monsterified has some type of fever at the time, and it decides to evolve along with him. And once that starts spreading and killing, she gestured at the island. Fun times. But how do those plague classes you mentioned factor in? Mireille asked, face scrunched up in thought. I hadn't heard of such things before. The doctor turned back to the island and spoke quietly. Well, the information is generally kept quiet for good reason. But it never is kept quiet enough. It's a simple thing, really. Think about it, if you get infected with something truly nasty and deadly like a magical plague that doctors struggle to cure, what options are there? Grit your teeth and try to wait it out. Fayette tried. Olivia shook her head, wistful. Some people, yes. But think of levels and classes. How could someone get a resist disease skill, one strong enough, as easily as possible? That one isn't easy to get as a general skill, trust me. Mireille snapped her fingers in realization. You need an appropriate class. Exactly, Olivia said, nodding. Renounce your old class, and see what is available. If you are fighting off an illness, you will have new options. Infected classes generally offers some resistance, though one level is usually not enough. How do you think classes like that level up? Fayette's gaze darkened, and she looked back to the island ahead, imagining people skulking there among the already monsterified, spreading it further. Do people really do that? Spread disease to save themselves? That type of person, it felt fouler than a bandit to her. So this is going to be nasty business, Fayette said, gripping her broom. If we get hit with something, can you cure it? I always have my swap condition, Olivia said, turning back. But that requires someone. What about your pills? Mireille asked. And that, finally, quieted the doctor. She stood there for a moment, frozen in thought. Then, slowly, she reached into a pocket, taking out a pitch-black pill that seemed to devour the light. The gloomy woman stared at it for a moment. Maybe. Just, maybe. Everyone stared at the pill, but nobody voiced the question. Even if it felt more ominous each day. Mireille finally sighed, then turned away, back towards the town. Well, I guess we should head out to the officials. I want to get some proper sleep in one of those mask things. Fayette felt a bit nervous about dealing with officials after their previous ordeals, but according to Marie, their hunter party had never been implicated in any of the reports that had spread out. Only Marie's involvement had really gotten out, and who would expect a lady to be playing at hunter? Still, seeing so many guards give them odd looks did make her nervous until she remembered why those looks were odd. What kind of hunter would voluntarily come deal with something like this? That and the oddness of their party's composition. Fayette shook her head. We'll show them. But it was still annoying, so she closed her eyes as they walked, focusing instead on her dust sense to navigate. If I need to train these things, maybe I should do some type of closed eyes thing for a while. Maybe that will teach me something. She ended up tripping a bit here and there, but that's what training was all about, right? It was a quick walk back to the main plaza where hunters were meant to gather, and Fayette finally opened her eyes once she felt the dust on the streets grow too chaotic for navigation. Too many people out here. Then she finally took in the view. It wasn't exactly crowded, per se, mainly because the plaza was just so large, clearly meant for crowds in the thousands. Empty vendor stands stood all over the white brick square which ended on a grand staircase. Following the steps with her eyes, Fayette looked up at the city's grand cathedral, a shining tower of white marble which loomed like an unlit candle. There were many guards, some soldiers, and quite a few hunters. Maybe just over 100 hunters, but they felt the most high level of the bunch, handling their weapons with confidence rather than bravado. Around half of them already wearing those beak-like masks, and the rest were waiting in lines by the humble Hunters Guild building, which had set up reception tables outside the main door. And among those hunters, there were also familiar faces. A friendly voice greeted them. Ah, your lot. I was wondering whether you would turn up here, said Martin, the silver-haired former cook, walking out from the line to greet them. Mireille stepped forward to greet him with a quick nod. Hello, it hasn't really been a while, has it? Didn't expect to see your group here. Ha. Sure, danger abounds, but so does duty. Martin said. He pointed back at the line, and Fayette saw his son and the rest of his party there, waiting patiently. Our families come from nearby, so we just couldn't bear the idea of not helping. I see you've kept your guest too. Marie nodded. I am still traveling in this company, yes, though I would appreciate you keeping quiet about seeing us earlier. A keen look flashed in the man's eye, and he nodded, serious. Of course, of course. Lips sealed. Thank you, Marie said, giving a quick bow. Has there been any information on what the plan is? Fayette asked. I noticed our target is beyond some water, and I'm not sure swimming there is a good idea. Ha. I trust there'll be boats, but the plan hasn't been decided yet. The big shots are yet to arrive. Fayette quirked an eyebrow. Big shots? Has there been word on high-level doctors? Olivia suddenly asked, looking around at the crowd. This sort of thing, you need the best. Martin shook his head. Haven't heard anything, guess we'll have to wait and see. But it should be any moment now, it's been a few days and... Suddenly, A hush went through the plaza, and all the crowds quieted. Feeling a tingle in her spine, Fayette spun around, looking towards the main road out of the area. A carriage was rolling down the avenues and actually rolled over a canal, treating the air like a steady road. The carriage was pulled by 2 snow-white horses, and it was painted with brilliant blacks and violets reminiscent of a night sky. Gemstones that emanated mana were inlaid all over, and lines of arcane power spread out from them, forming a weave more complex than any Fayette had ever seen. It thrummed with power. The carriage moved calmly forward, then pulled to a stop right at the plaza's entrance, and the guards suddenly fanned out, forming a corridor of spears leading all the way to the main cathedral. Following the path with her eye, Fayette noticed that a pair of men had appeared at the doors of the cathedral, and now were waiting at the top of the stairs. The carriage's door swung open, and 2 men stepped out. One tall, confident, and dressed in robes. One shorter, rather pudgy, but with keen eyes. A moment after, a third one followed behind the other 2. Seeing the arrivals, Marie gasped, eyes widening. "Do you recognize them?" Fayette asked, bumping her with an elbow. The lady nodded, eyes not leaving the advancing pair. Martin wasn't kidding, these are big shots. Most important in the monarchy, maybe. Fayette quirked an eyebrow, looking again at the 2 who had exited the carriage. The man in robes she could imagine being important, while the other was just, not what he imagined really. Turning, she considered the 2 waiting by the cathedral. An important priest and his bodyguard? At least the priest looks wise. Most important in the monarchy? Mireille asked, stepping closer. Details please. Don't say that so loud. Marie hissed, looking about. I'm serious. First, she pointed at the man waiting atop the stairs, a wizened-looking man in grand, priestly robes, a great white cap on his head. Archbishop Villefort, second in command of our church. Then she pointed at the pudgy man, steadily marching towards the staircase. He wore fine robes and his eyes constantly roamed around, displeased, as if he was cataloguing every misstep he saw. Lord du Angler, often called the Lord of Industry, though I doubt his class is actually that. He owns most of the factories in the country through his many companies. Lastly, she pointed at the tall man in robes, maybe 40 years of age, who walked as if he owned the world. He had an array of gleaming gemstones on his belt, and they all emanated powerful elemental energies. Grand Magus Mondauk, peerless researcher, second highest level mage in the monarchy. He runs St. Jean Academy. Fayette nodded, then focused on the third man who followed the pair. Is that guy important? Marie squinted for a moment, then shook her head. I don't recognize him, and based on how he's walking, I'd wager he's an assistant. Odd that there's only one for the 2 of them. Odder that there's not a doctor with them, Olivia added, frowning. Fayette whistled quietly, eyes following the advancing pair. They do sound pretty important, I'll admit. Are they high level? Marie took a step closer and whispered quietly in Fayette's ear. Supposedly they're all over level 50. I don't think we'll have anything to do with them, but if we do, be careful. Mireille poked her. Seriously? Promise. Right, of course, Fayette said, thinking. The pair and the man trailing them had finally reached the staircase, and to her surprise, it was the Archbishop who descended down. They talked together for a moment, then began walking to a fancy-looking restaurant by the plaza's side. I guess they prefer a more pleasant venue for meetings. I hope they have solutions. High-level people whom. Struck with a fit of inspiration, Fayette suddenly closed her eyes, focusing on all her other senses one by one. Eavesdrop felt too risky to use, and dust sense was a bit too chaotic for the plaza. Her danger sense almost felt like it was pinging, but not quite. But that wasn't everything, there was something else. For a while now, Fayette had been able to get a vague sense of people's classes, a maid's sense of social position or something like that. And it was that feeling she focused on. And it felt stunning. Overwhelming. Never before had she been so near truly high-level people, let alone 3 of them. And as she finally realized the distance between herself and the peak of power, something else noticed too. Conditions met, danger sense and dust sense can be merged into maid sense. Use 2 skill points to merge? Y/N. Fayette opened her eyes and grinned. Maybe this training thing isn't so hard after all. Chapter 73 Interlude, The Plan. Sure, it was great that a maid was receiving a revelation on new skills, but truth be told, that was a minor matter in the grand scale of things. A magical plague was a big issue, and naturally, important people would have to decide how it would be dealt with. To be more precise, 3 important people. One a master of the arcane, one a leader of the faith, and the last a magnate of industry. 3 key facets of the nation, and the backbone of its strength. It was time for their meeting. There were a few others present too, of course, a meeting needed assistance and such, and Cadeau Ross was one of those. True, calling an I-level 40 mage a mere assistant might be a bit odd, and he was important enough to ride in the same carriage as 2 of the important ones, but he still paled in comparison. Not that he minded it. In fact, Cadeau was rather pleased with himself for managing to secure a place at this meeting. As he opened the door to the rooftop terrace and gave a proper bow to Grand Magus Mondauk, he had to work to hide his eager smile. Meetings like these made history, and he was going to be part of it. Further success in his career was practically guaranteed. He patiently maintained his bow as the Lord and Archbishop followed the Grand Magus into the room, and then stood up when only the High Templar bodyguard remained. They shared a glance, some small spark of understanding passing between them. Cadeau smiled, gestured for the heavily armored man to enter, then followed him in, closing the door behind him. The venue was a pleasantly warm dining area atop the restaurant, kept at summer temperatures with an indulgent use of magic contraptions. The murmurs of the crowd outside were similarly quieted by a privacy contraption, but vision outside was not blocked. The room had a single oaken table within, with 3 seats set and ready. After a few quiet but firm handshakes, the 3 important men sat down. The High Templar went to stand behind Villefort, eyes sharp and always on guard. Cadeau went to stand behind his own superior, Mondauk du Morsafe, and stood silent ready to take notes or follow commands as needed. Only Lord du Angler had no attendance, which made his disposition shrink before the other 2, but there was good reason for that. The guilty party rarely was allowed counsel. "This is a fine pit you've dug us, du Anglers," Villefort began. The old priest sighed and took off the hat that marked his office, laying it on the table in front of him. His eyes were tired. "People are demanding action, and I can only reassure them for so long. I've done no error." The Lord snapped back, slamming his fist on the table. "I have strict measures in place to ensure that pollution levels are kept steady and measured, according to plan as you know, and there have been no missteps in that. Yet accidents happen, and now we have this situation," Mondauk spoke, eyeing the Lord coldly. Every word the mage spoke sparked with arcane power, making his displeasure clear. He leaned back in his chair and gestured up at Cadeau. "Would you serve the wine? This will take some time." Cadeau nodded and reached into his own bag of holding, taking out one of the fine vintages kept there. He applied rapid cooling to the bottle, setting the temperature just right, then set glasses for the 2 men he had travelled with, then filled them. The High Templar procured a drink for the Archbishop. Trust only went so far. Mondauk waited for the drinks to be served, then took up his glass and enjoyed a long sip of the red wine. Setting it down, he finally turned back to the Lord. "I've received a report that your workers here have to come into the factory even if they're sick, as long as they can operate the machinery. Is this situation really that surprising?" Du Anglers did not flinch back at the accusation and maintained a steady gaze on the robed man. "Don't make insinuations that are unfounded. I've had the policy in place for over 1.5 decades, and this is the first time we've had such an incident." He looked at his drink for a moment but did not move to drink it, rather continuing his talk, eyes flickering between the other 2. "You both know we can't allow the shipyards to stall when flu season comes around. The last big war was a close affair, and without the reinforcements I provided." Villefort waved him off with a tired sigh. "What's done is done. Now we need a solution. Since it's you 2 who arrived, I trust the Grand Doctor is still unavailable." Mondauk nodded, grimacing. "The situation in the Vanga colony is still ongoing, and it would take him quite some time to travel back to the mainland. At least things here are contained, back there it spread out quite a bit." "Just our luck," Du Anglers cursed, shaking his head. Cadeau almost caught himself nodding along, then stopped, cursing the Lord's skills. "Damned influencers! Even if it is true." The Archbishop grimaced. "Without a level 50 doctor, things will be difficult to rein in." "Is that why you came, Mondauk?" The Grand Magus nodded. "I will resolve the situation. One way or another. We won't have another Thames scenario." Villefort nodded, some color returning to his face. That is a small reassurance, at least if we had another larger incident only 8 years after the previous. He took a long drink, eyes focused in thought, then finally turned back to the others. I think I can see how we should spin this. The Vanga situation. Lord Du Anglers asked, a spark of cunning glinting in his eyes. Yes, precisely so, the old priest said, setting his glass back down. Really, what are the chances that 2 magical plagues would strike us at once? We know one in the colonies was orchestrated by the Nordic Union, so why not this one too? Du Anglers smiled, revealing crooked teeth. That does sound sensible to me. Don't rest too easy, Mondaug said, giving the Lord a glare. I still hold you responsible for this, and I want recompense. The Lord grimaced, shrinking back in his seat. After a pause, he gave a terse nod. I'll get you more funding for your academy and projects. But I do have a condition. The Grand Magus gave him a threatening look, and a spark of magic flashed in his eyes. You are hardly in a space to give conditions. The Lord snorted. This will benefit us all, I am a patriot too, you know. My best shipyards are still overrun on that island, and we can't risk them being damaged anymore. The factories are one thing, but the yards hold 3 almost complete dreadnought-class vessels. We can't risk that, it's a setback of years. I see, Mondaug answered, looking at the crowds below the terrace. He thought in silence for a moment, then finally nodded. I can make sure they're cleared promptly. I need a foothold on the islands to handle the cleansing, so we'll make our landing on the shipyard, clear the area, and then you can save what you can. How do you plan to do it? Du Anglers asked, face doubtful. I won't have you raining fire on my shipyard. The Grand Magus gave him a look and shook his head. He gestured below the terrace, at the many hunters gathered at the plaza. Of course I won't do that part myself. Why do you think we called in hunters? Leave the monster hunting to the specialists. I'll just deal with the final cleansing, and make sure no traces are left. He gestured up, and Cadeau held his breath. Finally, my opportunity has come. I'll have my assistant handle leading the assault. I trust you'll be fine, Cadeau. Cadeau nodded eagerly. Of course, sir, I'll make sure to handle matters just as you need. Should I note down specifics? Later, Mondaug said, waving a dismissive hand. He looked at his assistant for a moment, frowning in thought, then turned to the Archbishop. I don't trust those plague mask artifacts, too mass-produced, not enough focus on quality. Villefort, I expect you will do your part too. The wizened man didn't hesitate, just nodded and began to stand up. Of course I'll ward your men. He turned to Cadeau. Please approach, child. Cadeau felt his heart thundering, as those old but kindly eyes turned to him. Am I really going to? With reverence, he stepped forward, and kneeled in front of the Archbishop, holding his breath. The man nodded and then spoke, activating a skill far greater than a mere capstone. Chalice of bestowing. A gleaming chalice made of silver and gold inlaid red gemstones appeared in front of him, floating, filled with sparkling essence. All eyes in the room went to it, gazes of reverence and greed. Only the High Templar remained vigilant, protecting the treasure his duty was beholden to. A true relic of the great Saint Jean, passed down in skill form. Cadeau's eyes widened, and he froze still from shock, staring at the golden cup. I'm going to receive the blessing? Archbishop Villerofer reached a hand inside, grabbing a fistful of sparkling essence, which he brought to Cadeau's forehead. He drew a calm and precise square there, the symbol of the faith, and the glimmering energy began sparkling. Applying temporary tag Crusader. Temporary skill divine plague resistance granted. The clear female voice sounded younger than usual, and as the words faded, a sparkling amulet materialized around Cadeau's neck, and he shivered at its cold touch. Reverently, he felt at it with his hands. Thank you, Father Villefort, he finally said, managing to drag the words out of his stunned mouth. Villefort nodded at him, then dismissed the chalice and sat back down. Don't remove that amulet, and keep to the teachings of the Church, and the blessing should stay for quite a while. You may get up. Cadeau got up and returned to stand beside Mondaug, eyes shining. The Archbishop turned back to the other two, who had fallen silent at the display. There were few people who did not feel longing for that power upon seeing it, but the Church had held it for many hundred years now. There were reasons for that. I can do a few more of your men, as the need arises, Villefort said, leaning back in his seat. But the reservoir has limits. Mondaug smiled and stood up. Well, I believe that covers everything for this initial meeting. Shall we finish things? I don't see why not, Du Anglers said, standing up too. Villefort was last to rise, taking his bodyguard's arm for support. Cadeau rushed to refill the Grand Magus's glass, then took a step back from the three. All three men looked at each other, nodded, then held up their glasses. They spoke as one. For Queen and country. For glory and conquest. And last of all, for the return of saints. They took the glasses to their mouths, drank everything down in one go, then threw them onto the ground, smashing the glass to bits. Remnants of the wine flowed through the sparkling shards, like blood in a jungle of daggers. And so, the meeting ended, with Cadeau watching over it all enviously, hoping he would one day stand among them. After the meeting, Cadeau stood outside the restaurant, taking notes as the Grand Magus spoke. I'll need to secure several locations with minimal monotaint in them, so make sure to measure proper places once you get there. Yes, sir. They were veiled under a sound-dispersing magical field, so nobody else could hear them speak. Still, Cadeau felt the many gazes from the people at the plaza and relished the feeling. If I perform well at this, maybe I would even get a level up. The Grand Magus was silent for a moment, then reached into his pockets, handing out one last note for Cadeau. Here is a list of ingredients and tools I'll need from the Academy. Handle the requests and deliveries. I authorize the usage of the highest speed transfers. I'll need to prepare the ritual for 3 days, so your duty will be to ensure everything will be ready by then. Am I understood? Clear as light, Cadeau said, taking the note and adding the items from it to his to-do memo. Mondaug thought for a moment more, evidently making sure he had not forgotten to mention anything, then finally turned. Then, I'll be off. The Grand Magus snapped his fingers, tapping into one of the many gemstones at his belt. One began glowing with a clear white light, and a torrent of wind covered the man. Slowly, his robes billowing furiously in the wind, he rose into the air, then flew off with the speed of a hawk. Cadeau followed his flight until he disappeared into the distance, then turned to the plaza, smiling at the gawking eyes. The sir always does know how to make an impression. Chuckling, he dismissed the privacy field and began making his way to the Hunters' Guild desk, weaving through the myriad hunters gathered. Most were wearing the masks by now, though the nearest disease carriers were quite a distance away. Cadeau felt at the amulet by his neck, glad of the safety it provided. I wouldn't step within 100 feet of an infected with only a mask like that as protection. Handling things with the guild was a quick affair. He had to speak with the guild head for a few minutes, then wait as the people were gathered up, and soon he was standing atop the plaza's grand staircase, looking down at the mass of hunters waiting below. Now, with the big three gone to handle matters of their own, this rested on him. The first strike in solving this crisis, a moment that would be noted down in history. Already he saw some people ready to take notes, ready to mark his words down to history. Finally, he no longer faded into the background. For a long moment, Cadeau let the silence hang as he observed the people who were his to command. Many were holding bows, throwing spears and other ranged weapons, as few wanted to risk close combat in a situation like this. Then, his gaze paused, falling on one grouping rather different than the others. Not wearing armor, but dresses. 4 women, quite distinct from the other mass. And one especially. Is that a maid? He almost thought they were passing civilians or officials, but they all had masks in hand. He shook his head. There really are all sorts of weird people in this world. A hunter in a maid outfit, now there's a joke. Then, finally, he activated his voice-enhancing artifact, and spoke. Hunters. I thank you all for answering the call of duty and coming to aid us in this crisis. He would have liked to lay the blame on the Nordic Union right then and there, but that task would be on the Archbishop, whose word could overpower truth spells much easier. Still his words managed to stir the crowd enough. Grand Magus Mondaug himself will handle the final cleansing, but we will need your aid in laying the foundation. Tomorrow at dawn, we shall begin with an assault on the island, and grab a foothold there. Faces full of anticipation lit up, and Cadeau felt his soul stirring. This was why he loved his job, even if he was a mere assistant for now. Just seeing how much power a single name could hold over people, it was tantalizing. One day. Naturally, danger abounds, but have no fear. We have doctors on hand, ready to treat any who fall ill. Reassuring as those words were, they weren't quite as true as they seemed. The doctors who they had managed to gather were hardly high level enough to actually treat a magical illness, and fewer still would agree to come in close contact with a patient carrying one. Most would work strictly with aftercare if a patient managed to fight off the initial symptoms by themselves. Still, as he watched his words sink in, he saw relief on many faces except. His eyes once more went to that one group, of women in dresses. They did not seem reassured but rather had eyes that simmered with doubt, deepening as they listened to the one dressed in black say something. "What's that about?" Cadeau focused back on the moment, then ended his speech with a few more pretty words and began walking back down the steps, toward the inn where his room was booked. As he looked at the dispersing hunters, he couldn't help wondering how many would make it alive in the end. There was a reason soldiers and guards were not being used as the primary force for this. True, they would fare worse against inhuman foes than hunters, but more importantly, training new ones was expensive, and losing any would be costly. Hunters, meanwhile, tended to spring forth on their own, chasing dreams of glory and wealth. Rather handy for situations such as these. They would be well paid of course, but still, he felt grateful for the amulet around his neck. Sacrifices are fine, as long as they fall to others. Chapter 74 Fayette's Training Regimen. It was the dawn of the next day. The sky had darkened from yesterday, threatening rain, but none had come down just yet. The storm was waiting. And Fayette hoped it would keep waiting, because zombie killing in the rain sounded like messy business. Or maybe it would be cleaner than the alternative. Fayette watched the ocean waves crash against the pier and felt the wind on her forehead. Would all the rain wash away the grime and blood? Maybe that would be good. She felt a prod at her back. "Faye, focus on the briefing," hissed Mireille, quiet but piercing. Right, of course," Fayette answered, shifting her gaze back up. Her party was gathered around her, and they were currently with the other hunters at the pier which sat opposite the closed-off island, listening to instructions on what was to come. Sadly, those instructions couldn't have come from a more boring guy. Mr. Cadeau, a rather toadish man, had apparently been placed in charge of the first foray, and he now stood on a few stacked wooden crates, like the tackiest statue Fayette had ever seen, croaking out orders in his droning voice. At least his robes are presentable. And I reiterate, it is vital that the Le Pharaon or the other ships are not harmed in the process, so leave those to the specialists hired for the purpose. Now, as to the doctor presence. Fayette sighed, zoning back out. "I missed too much, and now I have no idea what he's going on about." She took a step back, then leaned to Mireille's ear. "Hey, I missed too much, can you fill me in?" The seamstress threw a sharp glare her way, but after pursing her lips for a moment, eventually relented. "Fine. It's nothing much yet. Just that the people hired by Lord Du Anglers will handle the actual ships in the shipyard, and that us hunters should stick to our assigned zones." "There are other hired people?" Fayette asked, glancing about. "Yes, apparently the Lord has some specialists on call. Don't count on them too much, they're not here at the briefing, so I doubt they'll be helping our parts much." Fayette squinted her eyes and cast out her senses, confirming that indeed there were only other hunters present here. It was easier to get a sense of such things now, after what she had gotten yesterday. Her new made sense. Of course, she had taken it. The 2 skill points she had were burning a hole in her pockets by now, and she had been anxious to finally use them. And it was a brand new tier 2 skill, the only other one she had was her Maid martial arts. The gains were interesting. Her danger sense and dust sense had fused into one, freeing up one general skill slot, so naturally quite a lot had changed. She could still sense dangers when they came, but those dangers now included ones of a maidly sort too, like a drink about to spill over or a garment in danger of falling into mud. The sense of dust had also expanded, turning into a more general cleanliness sense. Less accurate and precise, but a lot easier on the mind. However, the key difference came in the new bits, the ones her breakthrough had been reliant on: social position. Hunters, nobles, merchants, and priests all had a rather distinct feel to them now, something beyond just clothes and bearing. Marie, for example, felt like someone she ought to curtsy before, even with her having renounced her family. Mireille felt similar to the merchants still around town, sharp, but willing to bend and bow, only to smirk afterward. And Olivia just felt odd. Fayette didn't quite know what that feeling meant yet. But the hunters attending this meeting, they all shared a general sense of freedom, of lacking shackles. Even if the classes of some were the same as the ones soldiers nearby had, the feeling the two gave off was a world apart. Soldiers and officers all carried a sense of rigor and order very far from this lot. They were so free that they had all gotten tired of wearing the plague masks after last night, and none were wearing them on anymore. A sudden collective understanding had spread that everyone would put them on once they approached the island, and not a moment before. Fayette had naturally agreed, it really was irritating on the face. She let her maid sense fade, satisfied. A worthwhile skill indeed. I hope advancing my other ones won't be too difficult, though it probably will. Oh, right, the briefing. I lost focus and got left behind again. Well, whatever. It wasn't like there really was much she needed to know personally, as Mireille and Marie were probably better at thinking through plans and talking with the other parties, and Olivia was on top of disease prevention a lot better than the Lord, probably. Fayette's eyes wandered off toward the waiting island once more, cloaked in shadow by the darkening sky. She was almost willing to bet it wouldn't feel quite that veiled to her now. I think my new skill is going to find quite a bit of use in there. She was willing to bet that infected classes would feel very particular. Soon the talk concluded, and the hunter parties were asked to split themselves into groups according to their capabilities. More ranged focused groups, which the majority were separated first, and next more heavy-duty teams were split off. Fayette didn't really know how her team should have been categorized. They were a bit light on the armor but versatile otherwise, so perhaps it was natural that they were left among the other all-rounders. The leader, Cadeau, had gone off to inspect the landing boats, and so it was a younger mage who was left to explain matters to the three parties left over, Fayette's own crew, the Salted Knives, and a third group of lean men in leather armor. The mage didn't introduce himself, instead looking over the leftovers critically for a long minute. Finally, seemingly satisfied, he nodded and spoke. The other two groups are going to be in charge of clearing out the open areas, baiting out the larger hordes, and securing the perimeter. This leaves you with the last task, sweeping the buildings for any monsters or civilians hiding inside, and dealing with them. Fayette almost rolled her eyes. So we get cleanup duty, typical. Though. I can't really complain, can I? Didn't we name our party something like that? Maybe he saw it on the form we filled out. Are you suited for the task, or would the other groups suit you better? The man asked. He was answered by quick nods from Fayette's party and the Salted Knives, though the last party seemed more hesitant. After a moment of debate, they too nodded. Martin raised his hand. The mage nodded at him, and the silver-haired rogue stepped forward. You said we would deal with any people we found there. How? The mage was silent for a moment, thick eyebrows going together, and then he nodded. Right, well there's only one option really. Any of them could be carrying the disease, or have taken on an infected class. Confine them together until we can have a doctor check up on them. We can't let them wander about freely. After that, we'll gather them together and shelter them. Olivia stomped her foot on the ground and raised her hand, and all eyes turned to her. If you do that, confining everyone tightly together, you'll end up with even the remaining healthy people infected. The mage turned to her, narrowing his eyes, but did not raise his voice. The safety of our doctors cannot be compromised by letting them into areas with potential monster presence. Additionally, a sweep with our priests will have to be done to find any concealed infected. I am a doctor, Olivia said, standing up straighter for emphasis. I can diagnose people, so if we establish a central point to work from, everyone else could bring people in for me to check. Additionally, we have. Olivia almost continued, but then her eyes went back to Marie and she stopped, leaving out the last bit. Fayette tensed. Right, revealing too much about Marie's class might be bad. You have what? The mage asked. Olivia pursed her lips, frowning, and almost began to speak until Fayette raised her hand. Sorry, I have a skill that lets me get a feel for classes. I might be able to identify infected. The mage's eyes turned to her. Might be? How accurate is that? Can you guarantee it? Well, mostly accurate. Maybe. It's a new skill, Fayette said. The mage stood silent, black robes billowing in the wind, regarding Fayette and her team with sharp eyes. Until he finally turned to walk away. The doctor can do her plan, but your skill sounds too unreliable. I'll go ask if any priests volunteer to go and see if I can get this group reinforced. Would be splitting up too much otherwise. For a brief moment, he looked back, giving Olivia a curt nod. Thank you for your assistance. And then he was gone, walking forward like a soldier on a parade march. Fayette followed him until he was out of sight, then shook her head. She turned to the others. Am I the only one who thinks that went surprisingly well? Olivia sighed. No, I expected more trouble too. I'm usually never taken seriously. Is this what things are like when officials get serious? Mireille asked. This type of thing is very bad, so maybe they're setting away all preconceptions. Fayette turned to the side, finding a lady in deep thought. What do you think, Marie? You look like you have some idea. Might be a military mage, that one. Had an officer's bearing to him, she said. Are those types smarter then? Fayette asked. Marie shrugged. No, it's a matter of skills. I think he might have been using some sort of skill to check whether you knew what you were doing. Eyes had a distinct look to them, they always try to make it not show. Sounds really handy, if he wait. Does that mean he thought I didn't know what I was doing? Fayette almost reversed her opinion of the man, then remembered that she really didn't know exactly what she was doing. Still, she threw out a half-hearted glare to send him out. You know, he never even said his name, Mireille said, sighing. I wish he was in charge instead of that Cadeau fellow. Marie tapped her on the shoulder, then began to walk forward. Nothing we can do about that, let's go talk with the other hunters. Fayette saw that the other two parties had already gathered together to chat, seemingly old friends. Or maybe Martin is just the type to pat even new acquaintances on the back familiarly. Fayette followed the rest of her party and gave a nod to Martino and the ranger of the party. She didn't really remember the other two members. But as she didn't remember them, they probably weren't that useful or important people, so she instead regarded the new team, the leather-clad trio. Seeing their approach, Martin waved his hand, a friendly smile on his face. Introductions. Let me do the introductions. Unless you've already met. He gave the man he was talking to a questioning look and received a shake of the head in reply. Right. First off, these fine lasses here are they, sorry, forgot your party's name, but fine hunters. Don't let the pretty looks deceive you, they hide sharp thorns. Mireille sighed. Good to see you too, but really, flower metaphors. Martin laughed. Ha, what did I say? Right, then this lot here, he pointed at the trio of men, and they stood straighter, they're a party called Mousetrap. Right, party of trapper hunters they are, Weasley sorts. Fayette looked over them with new eyes. Their party's name is Mousetrap? She took a step forward and gave a polite curtsy. A fine name you have, keep up the good work. The tallest of the three, a man built like a gangly tree, elbowed the one in the lead. I knew we should have changed the name, Edmund. The bullier man elbowed him back. Shut up, Louis, it's a fun name. The third man, a shorter sort, stayed back and only gave a silent nod. Hey, I was being genuine, it's a good name. Fayette said, crossing her arms. Getting rid of mice and rats is important work. Louis shook his head, a weary frown on his face. I know, was a farmer's son, but still, it ain't the sort of work an experienced hunter should be known for. Edmund just chuckled, and his thick frame shook with the laugh, like a wine barrel with too much pressure within. Have a sense of humor. We're trap specialists, and our first job was giant rats. What other name could we have taken? Fayette internally agreed with him. At least their name is one that people remember. Now that I think about it, our first real job was rats too. Maybe we could become Broom Rat? Smash Rat? How would it go? She spent a few minutes thinking of suitable rat-type party names, discarded them all as not actually that good, then focused back on the conversation, and found that Mireille was talking strategy with the other party leaders. If we're setting up a spot for Olivia, we'll want Mousetrap on guard, and then the rest of us would do the clearing and searching. So I get to go on the hunt for monsters and infected? Fayette smiled, then focused on her made sense again. The Mousetrap trio gave off a sneaky and prickly impression, while the salted knives felt more aggressive. I wonder how good this skill will get when I put more skill points in it. Though maybe I should put it in other stuff first, I have so many things to work on. Again, her eyes wandered back to that waiting island, and she found it didn't unsettle her. Not really. Sure, a plague was a terrible thing, but cleaning up such matters was her whole job these days. It was what a maid was supposed to do. And if she did the job well, she would level. She quietly reached into her apron of holding, taking out her broom, the newer one. Made of reinforced ironwood, and finished with iron at the handle end. It felt heavy but sturdy. Fayette gave it an experimental spin in her arms, letting her body fall into her familiar maid martial arts. Then she examined the process closer. Am I really getting the full potential out of this just going on as I am? Will my skill evolve into anything good if I just keep at it like this? The motions, whirls, steps forward and broom smashes felt natural now, as if she had been practicing them for a lifetime. But she hadn't. It was all coming from a skill. Not really her training and experience. She wanted to take it further, to really find something new and of her own make. But she wasn't a noble knight who could spar with expert trainers and find new insights that way. She was a maid. And she had always learned on the job so far. And that was why she didn't dread the island or the job. What better training dummies than a bunch of monsters? As Marie began to turn back her way from the conversation, Fayette hid her smile. Chapter 75 Maid Bash Zombie Smash. Soon, the time for the assault came. The hunters boarded the boats waiting for them, then slowly but steadily crept toward the island. It was only a passage over the water, but the boats in use weren't that big either, fitting 10 passengers each. The gondola-like wooden vessels were crewed by 4 rowers each, who moved in sync, dragging enormous oars back and forth. Fayette found herself following the rhythmic motion with her head, back and forth, back and forth. She imagined a broom going back and forth in place of the oar, sweeping away any nastiness lurking in the waters. Is that how a water maid works? I've got water magic now, so maybe I could become one of those. She looked at the bucket laying on the ground in front of her, lid on, and imagined the slime within wobbling about like the waves. Water magic, how does it fit in with maid martial arts? Though now might not be the time. Or maybe. She quickly checked that no mages were near her, but of course there weren't. Their lot was mostly in the head boat, the largest of them all. Even the one nominally in charge of their group was there, preparing a spell of his own. I guess none of them would notice if I did just a bit. Idly, she channeled just a hint of mana, nudging the waves in the water just a bit. It was easier on her than creating water out of nothing, but not that much more useful in the end. Then she felt a prod at her side, and her concentration broke, along with the magic. Faye, put your mask on already, said Mireille, nudging her with a shoulder. Fayette grumbled, coming out of her focus. Hey! I was just about to have a revelation or something. You really don't have time for that, we're almost there. Stick to what you know. Fayette turned away from the oars, looking at the approaching island. It wasn't that far away now, and she could make out the tall warehouses and smaller office buildings by the docks, but not the ships being built. They would be on the other side, facing the wider ocean. Funny that. Even though they're all airships these days. Guess history matters. The shipyard area was set to the western end of the island, blocked off from the rest by a sturdy wall, which probably made it ideal for an initial forward base. Probably why they chose this place. 3 larger buildings and a dozen smaller ones were dotted around the place, and Fayette focused on one of the bigger ones, her assigned zone. She could also see the shambling figures by the shore better now. It was a mixed group, and Fayette began identifying the different types she had heard of based on what she saw. Corpse-like, slow types, the standard zombies from all the stories. People who got the disease, but died from it before the magic modified them that much, so the rest of it went to keeping them up and moving. A few of them looked livelier, less pale in the face, more alive, and more monstrous. Gangly, long limbs, hunched gaits, and bulging muscles which spoke of inhuman strength. Ghouls. Technically more alive than the others, but reduced to mindless beasts. Letting the magic focus on strengthening instead of reanimation. Fayette looked down at the mask in her hands, a long and grim beak-like artifact, with a gleaming green gemstone inlaid at the end of the beak. With her new magical senses, she could feel it emanating a subtle aura around it, a field to keep off plague nastiness. Olivia said that these aren't completely effective, but it sure does feel better to have some magic equipment to use for once. She fastened it on and grimaced at the new weight she felt on her head. Fayette gave her head a quick shake to make sure it was firmly on and found it well in place. Still will take a bit to get used to. She turned to the others. Did I put it on right? Olivia looked up from her work, then got up and stepped closer to Fayette, examining her mask. Looks good to me. She said, satisfied, then sat back down next to Marie, who was helping her do a last-minute checkup of her doctor equipment. They would be splitting up for the first bit, Olivia and Marie staying behind to hold the fort while Fayette and Mireille would move out with the others. Mireille had given her spider pet to Marie for safekeeping, as she didn't think the little critter was quite grown enough for a tough job like this. Fayette watched Marie look over the healing potions, feeling conflicted. It felt odd too, separate like this. Especially after all the dangers they had faced. But Marie and Olivia would be quite safe with all the hunters and the mage who would be staying behind, while it was Fayette who would be going to hunt the monsters. She felt at her right hand, dragging a finger over the boon marker that was laying there. Marie had put it on just before they had boarded, and the spark of magic there felt electric. But Marie herself looked grim and worried, an effect only enhanced by the spider on her shoulder and the creepy mask on her face. "Hey Marie!" Fayette said. The lady jolted her head up, eyes brightening a bit. "Yes." Fayette used disarming smile. "Don't look so worried. Stop using that skill, you're really bad at covering it up," Marie said, but her lip was curled up just a bit, so Fayette thought it was worth it. "I guess the skill does work on her too." Fayette shrugged. "I've had more experience than most in fighting while keeping myself clean, so making sure I don't let anything nasty touch me will be much easier than for others. Just be careful, you can sometimes be a tad careless," Marie said, turning back to the potion. Fayette nodded, then saw that they were almost at the island. More of the basic zombie types were gathering on the shore, and she could now make out their rotting faces. Nasty stuff, the dead should stay dead, not come out to mess things up. At least the weak types aren't too smart. She stood up, stretched her shoulders, and picked up her bucket and broom. "You ready, Mireille?" The seamstress was still sitting, opposite her, and didn't make a move to get up. She shook her head. "I'm resting for just a bit. They won't need us for the start." "Really?" Fayette asked, quirking an eyebrow and looking at the coast. "We're almost there, and that's quite the welcome committee. Just watch, look at the main boat," Mireille answered, pointing at the boat the mages were on, along with many of the ranged hunters. Fayette eyed the vessel and saw Cadeau's figure poised at the front, a hand held up. Their boat quite a bit bigger than hers, mainly by width. 2 other mages stood by his sides, and a dozen hunters were holding bows at the ready. Fayette whistled. "A ranged volley to start things off, hey?" Then the man swung his hand down, launching a gleaming orb at the shoreline. It flew in a short arc, about as fast as Fayette could throw a ball, and landed among the gathered zombies. They rushed at it, piling up. Then it exploded. A gleaming fireball erupted, and monsters burst into blood, leaving behind glowing monster cores, but many of the zombies were only flung back, quickly getting right back up. Burnt, but not beaten. Until the rest of the barrage followed. Countless skill-boosted arrows followed, along with smaller fireballs from the other mages. Monsters were pierced, blasted, and sliced into pieces until only a wide pool of black-tinted crimson blood was left on the pier. Fayette felt just a bit of envy at the display. "If only I had fire magic like that." But still, she turned back to the others. "Isn't this too easy? Why do they even need us?" Olivia snorted and got up, all her supplies sorted back inside her bag. "Those are the easiest types, the dumb ones. The smarter ones are still out there, hidden. Lurking and waiting. Easy to bash a mage's head in, they say." Fayette turned to the shore, which was only 50 feet away now, and squinted her eyes. At first, she saw nothing, but then... one on the roof of the warehouse, crawling on its stomach. Something peeking out of a window, then pulling back to cover. 2 figures scuttling in a shaded nook, rushing inside a building. How many are monster, how many human, and how many of those are infected? All the other hunters on her barge were now getting up too, walking closer to the edge, ready to hop off. Fayette nodded at Mireille, and together they stepped right behind the salted knives, in position to be the second ones off the boat. Marie and Olivia got in right after, but Mousetrap was between them. And then the boats thudded ashore, and everyone was rushing out, and Fayette jumped to the waiting pier. It was chaos for a few seconds, people getting their footing and gathering into groups, but then Cadeau was roaring out orders, voice enhanced by magic. "Ranged squad with me. Spotters, find the targets. Gate squad, secure the wall and fortify it." Fayette moved, Mireille at her side, broom held up. More monsters were appearing, attracted by the noise and commotion. Zombies were rushing out of the buildings or lurking out from behind corners, but those ones got shot down fast. Hunters were running forward, shields and swords held up, barrier skills glowing, and some faster monsters made it to them. Fighting erupted, forming a front line that ran through the central clearing. Cadeau was still yelling. "Ghouls coming in! Shielding squad, hold them back! Establish the landing zone! And the rest of you clear those buildings before any sneak behind!" Fayette turned back one last time and saw that Olivia and Marie were already busy at work, hauling boxes out of the landing boats and dragging them onto land. Marie looked her way too, and stopped in place for a moment, staring. Fayette winked at her, then turned and started walking, then jogging forward. "Mireille, you remember our building?" The seamstress was already jogging right behind her and scanned the area ahead quickly. "Looks like Edmund is already set up by the door." The thick-set man had run ahead already, surprisingly fast for his frame, and was waiting by a two-story brick house with windows shattered and doors torn off. His job would be to make sure nothing snuck out while Fayette and Mireille cleared the building. There was fighting all over now, and the first of the hunters had already fallen. But Fayette was only focused forward, on her target, and on her skills. Trying to visualize what was about to happen. Fighting in narrow corridors and advancing into rooms full of hiding places. Dangerous enemies that one had to keep from touching you. Potential deceit from those they were supposed to rescue. Fayette shifted her broom in her hand, searching for just the right angle. "How should I do this? Spice won't work on zombies, and I haven't fought much without that for a while, a capstone won't help much, and neither will sweep dust." Basically, it was just her Maid martial arts and cutlery control she could rely on here. And maybe a hint of water magic. And her slime. It was happily sloshing around in the bucket as if it could anticipate the carnage to come. Or maybe it can sense that it has already begun. She reached the building, nodded at Edmund, then stepped through the door, ready for some proper practice. The building was dark, lit only by the scant light from a clouded sky. Many corridors led further in, but they stood ominous, not revealing a hint of anyone inside. But Fayette knew there were people and monsters there. Apparently, a mage had done a divination of sorts. Not that accurate, but it was something. Some humans. Some monsters. Looking at the long, eerie corridors felt familiar. Not like the manor or the cave, because she wasn't alone. A friend had her back. "Mireille, you remember the crypts in Palogny?" The seamstress stepped next to her. "Of course I do." "Same formation?" Fayette asked. She pointed her broom forward. "Block off corridors with your stuff, then clear them one by one. I move in the front, then you guard my back. I'll trust your instincts on this one. Which way should we start? Bottom up? Cellar first, and on the second floor." Mireille nodded. "Should be fine." First, they headed to a short side passage, arriving at a creaky staircase leading down to the basement. It was a simple formation, Fayette in the front, advancing with a broom in one hand and a slime-filled bucket in the other. With her maid sense she could feel the general layout of the place even in the dark, but only within her general field of view. Mireille brought the rear some distance away, laying down wires behind them and holding up a dim lantern for herself. Fayette sensed the stairs come to an end by a door and slowed her steps, watchful. With a quick eavesdrop, she heard hushed voices come from within, and stepping closer, saw claw marks on the door's sturdy wood. But it had not been broken open. So some people managed to barricade themselves down here. "I wonder how long they've been down there? How fast did things really go bad here?" They said in town that the outbreak was very sudden, first a sickness, then sudden chaos following. But it only stayed on this island, even if it was so widespread here. How does that even happen? She had no line of sight, so couldn't get a sense of the classes the people within had, but it probably wasn't worth the trouble. If they've stayed put this long, they can wait a bit longer. Too much of a hassle to deal with them now. Fayette turned around and began walking back up, meeting up with Mireille who had stopped in place. "Trouble?" the seamstress asked, voice a whisper. Fayette shook her head. "Some survivors. Seem to be doing all right, no point getting them out yet before we clear the rest." Mireille nodded and began unwinding the razor wire trapped hallway she had set up behind. It seemed to go rather fast for her now, only taking half a second for each bit she had set up. Much faster than it had been back in Palogny's catacombs. Fayette felt some relief at that. Guess she's gotten a decent bit stronger too. Hope she's not taking her slower advance poorly. It didn't take them long to get back to the first floor, and then they continued forward in the same pattern, past hastily abandoned rooms where paperwork still laid in place as if left behind only for a moment. The first few rooms and corridors they checked revealed nothing, but that only made what followed more ominous. The few paintings hanging by the walls seemed to stare into Fayette as she crept forward, taking care to not let the wooden flooring creak. Cold wind blew into the corridors through broken windows, bringing a scent of death. Then they arrived at another intersection, with a staircase to the left leading upstairs, and a passage to the right leading further inside. But sensed it ahead, right beyond the corner to the right enemies. She didn't need a skill for it, the smell, quiet groans, and sounds of shuffling steps were hint enough. Looking back, she signaled Maid to take care, then readied herself. In a smooth motion, Fayette stepped past the corner and readied her bucket for a throw. She took in her targets in an instant. 3 zombies, the normal slow types, were grouped together by an open door. Rotted faces turned to her. She aimed and thrust her bucket forward, and a cleaning slime flew at the frontmost of the zombies, splattering all over it. Flesh started sizzling with a noxious scent. And the others roared, then started rushing her. Fayette nodded calmly. 1, mostly down. She heard Maid begin fighting something by the stairway behind her, and moved her broom to a 2-handed grip. Then she ran right at the 2 remaining zombies, readying for an overhead strike. They shambled at her, claw-like fingertips reduced to bone swiping at her face. She ducked the strike and swung at the foremost one's head, putting all her strength in the blow. The creature made no attempt at blocking, and her broom crunched down on its head. And it went splat, dissolving into blood like monsters always did. And Fayette's eyes widened because the blood still had the monster's momentum. Shit, it's going to get all over me. The other zombie was only a few steps behind, but a mass of diseased blood was now splattering right at her. Fayette kept her hit moving down, bringing her broom to the floor, then pushed herself back with it, flying backward. She stumbled down onto her back, but the blood just missed her, splashing right by her feet. The zombie didn't. It jumped at her prone form and Fayette brought her broom up to keep it off, managing to push it just an arm's length away. Filthy legs pressed against her dress, weakening her maid armor. Filthier arms reached for her. Fayette saw that her beak-like mask was right by the zombie's face, then she pecked the zombie in the face, and it stumbled just a bit. Then, summoning all her strength, she kicked it off and sprung herself back, getting to her feet just as the monster reached for a new swipe. It was slow, weakened by decaying muscle. She was not. Her broom's metal end smashed into its face. Fayette took a step back as it too dissolved into murky blood, leaving a green-tinted monster core behind. Fayette took in some deep breaths, thanking the mask she was breathing through. That thing got way too close to my skin. I'll have to take more care with the blood splashes. She looked forward and saw that the slime was sitting in a sizzling pool of blood, eagerly devouring it, like a dog lapping at the water. At least you are good at handling this stuff. There were sounds of fighting still coming from behind too, but Maid wasn't yelling anything, so she was probably fine. Which was good, because right at that moment, 2 more figures crept into view from a further doorway, attracted by the sound. Fayette narrowed her eyes, and readied her broom again, sending a mental signal for the slime to lie in wait and hide. Because these 2 foes looked tougher. They were growling instead of groaning and didn't look dead. No, they looked twisted. Human forms as a base, but eyes glazed over in red, black veins spreading all over their bodies, and muscles bulging in unnatural ways. They looked at her for only a moment, then pounced. Like bulls trapped in human flesh, they were on her in an instant, and she had to take steps back as their powerful fists hit her broom, sending shocks through her bones and core. But she had commanded the slime to hide for a reason, and it was now behind them, waiting. Go! Fayette commanded it back and was rewarded with a roar of rage as the backmost ghoul fell to the ground, its left foot suddenly dissolving in the slime. The other one was distracted for a moment, and Fayette took the chance. Like hammering an anvil, she struck it fiercely, and the hand it brought up to block crumpled against her broom's metal end. Her next swing hit a leg, toppling it to a knee, and her third swing finally reached its head, cracking the skull to bits. Unleashing a new tide of blood. But this time Fayette was ready. She tapped into her new reservoir, activating her water magic. Sure, it was costly to generate new water, but adjusting the flow of a blood spray? Much easier. She stepped forward, and the blood parted for her, like a curtain rolling back, and she reached the second ghoul, which was getting back up. Fayette didn't let it. One more smack of her broom and it too dissolved. But Fayette wasn't done. She was feeling it, a flow, like she was on the cusp of learning something. And her eavesdrop had picked up more groans from ahead. So she left her slime there to recover from the magic she was using up, and ran forward to a doorway at the end of the hall, stepping through. Instantly, her maid sense picked up a different sort of presence. There were 3 normal zombies in the room, slowly turning her way, but there was also a fourth presence. Human. Fayette turned her head, and locked eyes with a dull-eyed young man, who was packing gear from an open cupboard into a backpack in a mad hurry. The zombies in the room weren't reacting to him at all, and his pale face was filled with sweltering pustules of disease. And his presence just felt so wrong, almost more so than the monsters infected. The man grimaced, face shifting oddly, and began lifting up his hand. The zombies in the room began to shift. And Fayette's thrown knife lodged into his throat, guided by cutlery control. He fell down, clutching at his throat, choking on blood. Fayette turned to the zombies and returned to a two-hand grip. One down. Then she moved like in a dance, because the normal zombie types were just so slow. 2 quick steps forward, broom down, and one head smashed. A tide of blood, but she tapped her magic, and it parted before her, and she stepped right through. 2 more steps and the next foe was quick enough to reach for her with long arms. Thrusting it forward like a spear, she wove her broom through the attack, hitting the monster's face and pushing it back. The hands went to the sides, and the zombie staggered back against the wall. 1 step forward, an overhead smash to the head, and another bloody splatter. She didn't need to part this one, it only painted the wall. Then for the last zombie. Fayette took a single step back and spun around a half circle, bringing her broom with her in the motion, hitting the last zombie on its left shoulder. It crunched under her blow, stopping a coming attack, and she stepped forward another step, bringing her broom away and back, and hit it right in the neck with the broom's other end. Crunch, splatter, and the last one was down. Finally, Fayette stopped in place, took a deep breath, feeling the energy still roiling in her veins, then snapped her head back to the infected. He was motionless dead. She still quickly smashed his legs with her broom, just in case the magical disease tried to reanimate him. Efficient, quick, elegant. Don't forget the blood too. Level up, you have reached Maid level 22. Congratulations. 2 skill points gained. Progress towards next level, 0%. Nice. Only then did she finally let herself calm, looking around the blood-soaked room. Wincing at the stench, she began to hurry back, stopping when she saw a seamstress staring at her from the doorway. Mireille looked at all the blood, then quirked an eyebrow at Fayette. You sure, we're efficient? Fayette relaxed the tension in her shoulders. You handled your part fine. Just 2 weren't normal sorts. Seemed to be trying to sneak behind us, Mireille said. Fayette eyed the pools of blood in the room, noting that the monster core within. She remembered that the ones the ghouls had left seemed different in coloring. Do you think those cores would be safe to take if I have the slime cleanse them thoroughly first? Maybe we'll leave them for now, and ask Olivia later? Being careful doesn't hurt. Did you manage to stay clean? Fayette nodded. Just barely, I was a bit too careless for a moment, but managed pretty fine after. Let's still check with Olivia after. Should we do this side by side then, for the rest? Mireille asked, turning to her. Fayette thought for a moment, then shrugged. Might as well. With how much noise we made and how little room there is left, I doubt we'll find many more monsters. You ready? Mireille asked, stepping back from the doorway. Give me a moment, Fayette said. She stepped out of the room too, noting that her slime seemed to be feeling groggy. Seems I used up my allotment of magic. I really need to get a better bond for that. She instructed it to get back in the bucket, then thought about her new skill points. I could use them right now, but I don't think there's an urgent need. Might be better to think on it later. Fayette tabled the thought, picked up her slime-filled bucket, then nodded at Mireille. Time to move out. And as she had expected, the rest of the building didn't have any more lurking monsters, they had all been attracted to their initial fight. There was one more pocket of civilians hiding out in the kitchen's pantry, behind a boarded-up door, but after freeing them, Fayette could only grimace at their sickly visages. After instructing them to wait a moment, she and Mireille did another sweep of the building, then checked outside. Things seemed to be mostly in control, with the perimeter established by the fighters far ahead and the wall blocking off the docks secure, though there were still sounds of sporadic fighting. Edmund had apparently caught 2 zombies trying to sneak out of the house, and Fayette gave him an approving nod. Seems to live up to his name. Then, looking back at the landing zone, they saw that Olivia was already busy at work, processing groups of civilians as they were led to her by pairs of hunters. Everyone was keeping a wide berth from the yet-to-be-cleared, wary of disease. Some of the people brightened after speaking to the doctor, heading off to a zone marked off near the boats with chalk. Others had their faces fall, then were directed to a building that had been secured to the side, where some specialists were already ready, wearing heavy protective gear. Hunters kept a wide berth from the second lot. People carrying the disease. Sharing an uneasy look, Fayette and Mireille headed back into the house and began guiding the hiding groups of survivors out, one by one. It was as they were guiding their last group of rescues back, that Fayette saw an odd face in the line of people waiting for judgment. Martin, silver-haired rogue, was first in line, nursing a nasty-looking bruise on his neck, and waiting for Olivia's words. The doctor gave him a long, calculating look, spoke some words, then pointed at the building on the left. Infected. Fayette blinked in surprise. He got hit with the disease? Even with that mask on? She had already made sure with Olivia that she and Mireille were safe, at least so far, but it felt odd to see someone she knew hit with the disease. Though, it hadn't been a bloodless fight. There had been casualties among the hunters too, though not too many. Cadeau and the other mages seemed to have gotten off with the least wear and were organizing matters by the shore. With the area secured, more boats were coming in, carrying more personnel, equipment, and rations. The group that had been cleared of disease were waiting by the boats, shifting about anxiously, eyes on the opposite shore. Their faces shone with hope. And Fayette spotted Marie near them, watching. The maid gave the group of rescues they were escorting a quick look, then turned to Mireille. "Mir, can you handle watching over this last lot?" Fayette asked quietly. Sure you didn't sense anything odd about them, right?" Fayette shook her head. "Nope, seemed to be normal classes." Mireille followed Fayette's gaze to Marie, then gave her friend a nudge with her elbow. "Go then." Nodding thanks, Fayette jogged off, past the line of people awaiting Olivia's judgment. She wove through a few people carrying crates into the newly cleared buildings and arrived by Marie's side. The lady turned to give her a quick smile, then went back to watching the crowd. "Doing all right?" she asked. Fayette nodded, lifting up her hand, a mark still on it. "Wasn't too bad, didn't even have to use your boon." Marie looked at the mark for a moment, then let out a breath. "I'm glad. What are you watching here?" Marie nudged her head forward, pointing at a trio of people a bit off from the other waiting civilians. "I'm watching those three." Fayette squinted her eyes, finding only three rather normal-looking people, ragged and gaunt as they were by the circumstance. However, casting out her maid sense, they felt like nothing. "What's up with them? They don't have." "Infected," Marie said quietly. "Lucky ones. Managed to get cured of the disease thanks to the skills they got, and they surrendered, not making trouble. Agreed to let their classes go after I made some subtle inquiries to some of the officials, and they were questioned." Fayette stared, not sure what she was feeling. "But they still took those classes, right? Why are they free like that?" "They hadn't really leveled, a priest already came to check. They'll have to go through a confessional, but they might be pardoned." She saw Fayette still staring and continued in a careful voice. "Why so curious? Did you encounter any?" Fayette nodded. "Found one, had to kill him." Marie sighed. "A shame he attacked you then. A waste." Fayette paused, thinking back. Had that man really been attacking her? She couldn't really remember the moment that well. What did he even look like? Was he trying to attack? He did lift his arm and the zombies were doing something. No, his class just felt so wrong, and there was no time. It had to be the right move. Marie had already turned back to watch the trio, but Fayette found herself feeling strange. Guilty? No, not really, but something about it all just felt off. Like a lot of things had felt recently. Fayette sighed, then stood up and began walking away, back to Mireille. "Why does this have to feel so complicated? It's supposed to be simple. Just remove the problem." Lost in thought as she was, she almost missed the commotion. Until there was shouting. Pulled back to the moment, Fayette looked to the side and saw that it was Olivia of all people who was shouting. At people who were. She focused on her maid sense. Similar to Olivia, but different. She squinted her eyes and took in their other equipment. Plague masks, but much more elaborate than the ones they had. And big bags with distinctive symbols on them, and long jackets protecting all their skin, none bare. Other doctors. Did they come here after all? Then the argument ended, fast as it had begun, and the newcomers took Olivia's place in processing the people. But Olivia wasn't marching away in defeat. No, she was marching toward the building housing the infected. With her eavesdrop, Fayette caught the doctor's parting remark, muttered under her breath. Damned, too cowardly to even try, I'll do it. At least, give it an attempt. And she also heard what the other doctors were saying. Bloody fool, at her level, one can only hope they manage to fight it off, mitigate risks, and help them recover after. Honestly. Pointless risk. And so, a gutter doctor marched off, fuming. To attempt something thought impossible for people her level. Chapter 76 Interlude, The Strongest Medicine. The diseased were housed in a red brick warehouse, now repurposed into a barracks of sorts. The dim storage hall had seen a rapid transformation, turning into a makeshift hospital in a matter of hours. Plywood walls had been hastily erected by builders to separate the patients, and crude beds had been assembled for them to rest in. Only a few doctors worked inside, wearing much heavier protective gear than Olivia as they guided the newcomers to their spots, more like prison wardens than nurses. Guards stood warily, grasping spears and checking over their masks and coats every few minutes. Nobody liked being around the sick. And there were many of them. Most had been easy to identify at a glance, with obvious signs of disease showing. Many were further weakened by days of hiding in squalor, evading monsters. They were a sorry lot indeed. To Olivia, it all felt nostalgic. It was a sight she had seen once before, quite a few years ago now. But even with the years, some things didn't change that much. Sure, the warehouse was rather different from the old clinic she had apprenticed at, but the methods, they didn't really change. See, magical illnesses were a tricky thing. Chiefly because of their unpredictability and constantly shifting nature, only truly gifted or high-level doctors had any chances of striking the diseases at their cores. Thus, the standard treatment procedures were rather ingenious in their simplicity. Olivia paused in front of one bed and eyed the patient resting there. He was a gaunt man of perhaps 50 or perhaps 30, his bloated face made it hard to tell. But just like all the other patients in their beds, he wouldn't be leaving any time soon. The shackle keeping him in place took care of that. A bowl of cold porridge was on the floor next to him, just in reach of his shackled self. The iron chain connected to an iron pipe that ran around the factory's far wall, secure enough to withstand even an enraged monster. Porridge and shackle. A carrot and a stick, one might say. Some nutrition to help his body fight the illness, and a manacle keeping him in check in case he failed and ended up mutating into a monstrosity. A simple treatment. Wait and see what happens. It made Olivia feel angry. She eyed one of the doctors with disdain as he locked another newcomer in place, then scuttled as far away from him as possible. Even with the enchanted gear he had on, nothing was sure. They weren't even trying to make things better. Not really. Just doing the bare minimum required of them, working first and foremost to keep themselves healthy. And they had tried to bar Olivia from even coming inside here. The thought sent a jolt of anger through her, but she held it in check. Too much was at stake, but still, she gritted her teeth. They just show up, late to the situation once things are clearer, and then try to dismiss me from it all. Didn't even believe I had a doctor class at first. It had taken an annoying amount of arguing and convincing, but she had finally been allowed inside here. So she held herself in check and did not say what was truly on her mind as the others passed by her. Sighing, Olivia shook her head and kept moving forward. She was only here to see one very specific patient, though she would be keeping quiet about the why of that for quite a while. Just like she liked to keep quiet about her past, and many other things. She had a lot of secrets these days. For example, she actually had gone past level 20 already. That last operation on Fayette's injury had put her at level 21. But Olivia had not gained a capstone skill yet, though that was how it was supposed to go for most classes. And she feared she knew exactly why. Her class was hardly the usual sort. But that was also the key, to why she might be able to do what the other doctors could not. She spent a few minutes walking the big hall, looking the patients over one by one until finally, she found the patient she had been seeking. Olivia approached a very specific bed. The silver-haired man lounging in it gave her an odd look. The doctor stopped a good distance from the aged hunter and pulled out a keyring from her coat. "Sorry, Mr. Martin? Let me open those shackles for you, I need to have a word in the back room. Patient confidentiality and all that. Please keep a small distance from me as we walk." One of the warehouse's back rooms had been furnished into a workable medical facility, beds, supplies, and all. Nobody had used it yet, so Olivia took her time inspecting the place, walking around the room, and peering into every single cupboard one by one. Naturally, at the center of the room, there was an examination chair for the patient to sit in, and the man waiting in it was starting to get anxious. The wheels on the bed squeaked as Martin's eyes followed the doctor, who was circling the chair like a shark. He had to break the silence. Excuse me? Why did you call me here? Olivia turned a half-circle, and her dark eyes fell on the aged hunter. He was surprisingly calm for someone who had been told he had the plague just an hour ago. Why, because you are ill, and I am a doctor of course. What other reason is there? His eyes narrowed. I haven't seen any of the other disease taken anywhere, and the talk was that none of the doctors they have here can cure us. What are you after? Olivia continued circling the room, at a languid pace, closing the cupboards she had opened as she walked. You are mistaken, there. I can cure you. In fact, I can guarantee it. But due to my methods, we have to be discreet. Her eyes jumped back to him. Understand? The aged hunter was silent for a moment, then leaned back in the chair. So, you're helping me first? Is this some nepotism thing? If so, I'm glad we're friends enough for that. Close, but not quite. Olivia completed a half-circle around the room, arriving right behind the chair, and stopped there, staring Martin in the back of his head. She still felt like the man had eyes on her, despite him pretending to the contrary. The light from the grimy windows lit the chair like a theater's stage, but Olivia kept just a bit away. It wasn't her time to become lead actor just yet. That was why she had chosen him. He keeps up a jolly front, yes, but his eyes are much keener than one would think at first. And his front is very deceptive indeed. But Olivia was good at pretending too, and she could recognize her kind. The doctor leaned forward, and just a hint of light hit her black hair. I can cure you, I guarantee it. But first I will need a small service from you. Nothing too big. Martin didn't turn to meet her eyes, but still, his words came as if he was facing right her way. So, the healer has a cost? He asked, then paused for only a short moment. He nodded. I can pay. Good, Olivia said, nodding, and circled back to his front. It's just, this is an important matter. One I can't leave to chance. And I just got the handiest skill a few days back. She put her hand out, as if for a handshake. I'll need to make a medical contract with you. The aged hunter looked at the hand, just a bit confused. You would touch hands with someone diseased? I'm confident in my abilities, Olivia replied, expression betraying nothing. A contract skill, what exactly are the terms? Martin finally asked, meeting her eyes once more. Olivia shrugged. A small matter, as I said. Help me put on a little performance, and do your best job acting. Then keep quiet about it after. The skills I used, those you think out on your own, speak of them to no one. It's important. Martin's eyes narrowed in intrigue, and he hesitantly nodded. All right, that sounds fine to me. Do I shake on it to activate the skill? Please do. Martin took Olivia's hand into his, gave it a brief but firm shake, then felt a skill activate. Olivia let out a nervous breath. It's done. She let her bearing relax and slumped back against the shelf behind her. Ah, glad you took it. Martin stared at her. Aren't I supposed to get a cure now? He asked. Olivia cackled, just a bit, then straightened herself up and looked at the man, a twinkle in her eyes. She used comprehensive diagnosis, nodded and gave a quick clap. Congratulations, you are cured of the plague. Martin stood up from his seat, gaze darkening. Explain. Olivia motioned him down. Oh, don't get me wrong, the gash you took is nasty and I'll give you some salves and the like for it, but you never had the magical illness in the first place. The aged hunter blinked. What? The doctor sighed. Look, sorry for scaring you with it. I just, really needed your help for a bit, and this bit of acting I need you for. I'll need to have you pretend to be diseased. The man was looking at his arms, and feeling the skin on them. So that's why I wasn't feeling any symptoms. Then he looked up at her, some genuine anger in his eyes. You really scared me with this. Martino was crying. Olivia flinched a bit at the hurt she heard in his tone, and gave him a sympathetic look. Sorry really. But, it's for a good cause. Believe me. Martin searched her eyes, looking for malice or further deception in them, and eventually nodded. He sighed and fell back into his seat. Fine, got the damned contract thing forcing my hand anyway right now. Though, it doesn't feel that strong. Not too high level of a skill, is it? I was hoping you wouldn't notice that, Olivia said, smiling nervously. But it won't be nothing either. Still, can I rely on your help? Fine, I'll do it. What's the gig? Olivia shifted to motion, grabbing pills and salves from her bag. Right, I'll take care of that wound of yours first, my part of the deal, and then she paused and looked at Martin's skin, frowning. You really do look too healthy as you are. I'll need you to eat some pills. Actually, many pills. Despite the relief from not actually having a deadly illness, those words still sent a jolt of foreboding through Martin. The aged hunter gulped and his face paled. Olivia smiled. Hey, that's already quite a bit better. There were many patients awaiting their fate in the compound, eyes listless and bodies weak. Some had rashes on their faces, others had blisters. Some were coughing up blood, others were pleading for more water to quench their parched throats. Some looked as if nothing at all was wrong with them. That was the group doctors were most wary of. The way the illness showed often told how it spread from those specific patients, but few were the same truly. Then there was Gaspard, who seemed to belong to all the prior groups at once. His symptoms came and went like the tides, but they were never the same 2 days in a row. First, he had coughed his lungs out, then yesterday he had felt completely fine, then overnight he had developed painful blisters on his fingers. That had been the morning. Now, as evening neared, the blisters covered his arms all the way to the elbows. He feared what would come next. Gaspard had felt some hope when the hunters had found him hiding in a cupboard, but that relief had faded the moment he had stepped into this prison masquerading as a hospital. Because the doctors, they were only watching. And waiting. The only help to come was one's own strength. Oh, how he hoped that he would be one of the lucky to recover on his own, but he didn't harbor much hope. He had felt hope yesterday when all the symptoms had faded, but he now knew better. Don't taunt the disease. Or it will taunt right back. So, he had chosen to lay still, waiting for whatever would come, head clear of thoughts. And then the backroom's door slammed open with a thundering bang, and all eyes in the hall went to the pair who emerged from there, his included. Clear the way. Guards, get over here, I need eyes and spears. Shouted a female voice, and then Gaspard's eyes widened. Not because of the doctor who emerged from the door, but because of the man shackled to the chair she was pushing. He had silver hair, and he looked absolutely terrible. His skin had an unnatural greenish tint to it, and red dots were spreading along it at an increasing rate. His eyes looked haggard, and his breath came with wet rasps. Something pricked at Gaspard's mind. Hadn't that man just gone in there? He didn't look half as bad just a moment ago. Then the doctor was yelling again. This patient's had a rapid flare-up of symptoms. I'll have to try an experimental treatment. Where are my guards? Everything burst into motion. The chair arrived at the center of the room with the squeak of wheels, and then the few guards monitoring the place arrived, pointing shaking spears at the man sitting there. A few of the attending doctors made to approach, but the dark-haired woman waved them off, and her intense glare stopped them in their places. No, not you lot, guards are what I need. I'm going to attempt a cure. But the woman hesitated for a moment, looking down at the man in the seat, and then she spoke to him gently. Are you ready? I warn you, this may be very painful. The silver-haired man struggled to lift his head up, but a subtle fire burned in his eyes. He spoke in a whisper, but somehow everyone in the hall heard it. Whatever it takes. The doctor nodded, then reached into her breast pocket, taking out a pill. She held it up in the air like a divine artifact, and all eyes in the room went to it, Gaspard's included. It was stark black. Ominous. Large. But could it really be a cure? But the doctors were saying there is no cure? Were they wrong? To confirm his suspicions, he glanced at the other doctors in the room and he saw their confusion even through thick masks and protective gear. They stood silent, glancing at the pill, at each other, and shrugging shoulders. Gaspard's heart thumped. They don't know what it is. Can it really work? The doctor handed the pill to the diseased man and took a step back. The man winced, apparently struck by a truly noxious scent. Even as far gone to the illness as he was, he still looked at the pill with disgust. How terrible is it? But regardless, the man ate it. And then began convulsing. Fight. You have to fight. Stay conscious and fight. The doctor shouted, voice high with hope. The guards tensed, fixing their spears right at the convulsing man, afraid he was monsterifying right on the spot. The other doctors in the room stared, unnerved. Only the dark-haired one remained calm, not stepping one bit back from the man. And then the symptoms started receding. A gasp went through the watching crowd, and the watching doctors froze in their places. Gaspard let hope once more grasp his heart. Because the man seemed to be getting better. Slowly at first, the red dots on his skin fell back further and further, and every second seemed to fill him with newfound vigor. The convulsing calmed, and the green tint to his skin started to fade, more and more, until he looked as if the illness had never had him. Gaspard realized that he had barely blinked for the 5 or so minutes the process had taken. He closed his eyes, then reopened them to confirm he wasn't seeing things. But it was true, the man seemed to be cured. Sure, he looked rather drained and tired, but that was a small price for salvation. But then the other doctors crowded in, voices loud in disbelief. This can't be. How could Amir? What is that? The dark-haired woman fought the crowd off, pointing them at the man who was still shackled to the chair. The gaggle of doctors quieted, and finally, the gloomy woman spoke. If you don't believe me, test him yourself. He doesn't have the plague anymore, it's true. Hesitantly, the crowd of white-clad people turned and approached the patient. Evidently, they didn't like getting too close to him, even with the heavy protective gear they were wearing. Gaspard saw eyes close in concentration and hands pointing at the patient as skills were activated. Then came the disbelief, and they crowded right back to the gloomy woman. It's true. He doesn't carry the disease. What did you give him? What was your method? What was your name again? I don't believe we were properly introduced. The dark-haired woman just smiled ominously and stepped back from them all. Sorry, afraid it's too experimental to be made public quite yet. A private method. However, she turned to the patients, who were all watching, eyes agog. She raised another dark pill into the air. Who wants to go next? Everyone began shouting and raising their free hands, but Gaspard did not shout. He only stared, eyes shining with hope. Maybe believing in salvation wouldn't be so bad this time? And as the doctor looked around the room, she saw his eyes. And smiled. With a wave of her hands, the shouting quieted, and then she was walking forward. You'll be the first. Gaspard looked first to the right, and then to the left, and then remembered that nobody was placed in the beds besides his. The hope he felt overflowed because the woman was walking toward him. Olivia's heart thumped nervously as she handed the man one of her pills, but she didn't let the emotion show on her face. She had to seem confident, mysterious, ominous. She never could do learned and practiced well, it just didn't fit her bearing. But she could seem dangerous. That was key. She lowered the tone of her voice, then spoke. Now, be ready. This may be extremely painful. If you want to survive, you will have to fight. And the pill just might be able to save you. Very experimental, understand? The man nodded, and his eyes still shone with that same conviction. That had been the reason she had chosen him. I will. Whatever it takes, if it can cure this. He ate the pill, then grimaced in pain. He didn't convulse. Olivia held her breath, frantically keeping her comprehensive diagnosis trained on him. She could feel the burning gazes of the other doctors on her back, but she tried her best to ignore them. This was the key moment. The moment that would either crash everything or make things worthwhile. She waited, long minutes, as the man sat there with his eyes shut, shaking just a bit from the pain, and nothing seemed to happen. Every second that passed was like a dagger thrust into her core, but she stayed standing despite them all. She had to. And then just a bit the man's blisters receded. Just 2 of them, on his right arm. And Olivia breathed out, feeling a tide of relief wash over her. She confirmed it with her diagnosis skill, and then let the relief roar through her soul. It's working. Slowly, so slowly, his illness was being fought back. Olivia smiled, then turned around. This patient has started his recovery, please keep a watch on him. She said, loud and confident. Then she started walking away, back to that back room. Away from the bustle of pleading voices and curious demands. Past Martin, still shackled to his chair. The hunter gave her a thoughtful look, and Olivia answered with a meaningful one. Do not speak of this. She was glad to have enforced it with a skill, even if it wasn't ironclad. It was something. She smiled, promised to be back in just a moment to the others, said a few words about how she should not be disturbed, and then stepped through the door, closing it behind her. Olivia collapsed onto the ground right there, hyperventilating. She let her calm fade, and almost started laughing madly at the spot. I can't believe that really worked. A magical illness cured, all with that one skill. It had taken her a lot of setup and preparation, a lot of practice and leveling, but yet again, her new skill had proved its worth. The skill that almost taunted her, mocking her lack of true medical skill, because it relied on the strongest medicine of all. Because her pills. They didn't truly contain anything of note. Just herbs to make them really nasty and painful. It was all just placebo. She laughed, just a bit, and then a tear slid from her eye, uninvited. She loved that she had managed it, but she hated the skill all the same. For what it represented. For why it came. Oh yes, Gutter Doctor was a class quite different from the others. There was a very good reason she had yet to gain a capstone skill despite her levels. She dreaded it so. But that was what her class was all about. It lay in the past. A past that haunted her to this day. 2 faces, burned into her memory. The only doctor class she had been able to take, despite what she had first sworn to do. It wasn't a coincidence that the skill domain she had gained with her class was titled Hypocritical Oath. Chapter 77 Interlude, Hypocritical Oath. Placebo. A skill she hated needing because it meant she had to rely on something other than her medical knowledge. Oh, it was useful of course, no doubt about that. Olivia had been putting every skill point she could into it. But, if only it was just the lack of skill. Finally calming herself, she stood up, took support from a wall, walked a few steps forward, and then collapsed down into the shoddy bed in the room's corner. The damned skill really did make her feel conflicted. The comments the other doctors had made to her really did sting. It had taken her a lot of convincing just to be allowed inside here at all, and they had even forced her to prove her skills by answering a deluge of medical questions. She had only managed to answer half. The rest, it had just been things she had never learned. Never had the chance to learn because her education had been interrupted. But she had persisted, shown her diagnosis skill, and the others had relented. What did they think of her now? Now that she had cured what was supposed to be way beyond her level or knowledge to cure. Because it really was. Olivia rolled around on the bed, staring at the dark ceiling above. She didn't really know how to cure a magical illness, of course she didn't. But she had managed to convince patients waiting in that room that she could, and that was all that mattered for the skill. Not her genuine ability in medicine. She had been honing her use of it ever since leaving Palogny. First smaller things, down in the mines. Helping her teammates manage in the darkness and heal minor ailments. And the more the pills had healed, the more effective they had become. Olivia winced, remembering the duel. Fayette even managed to stay off blood loss with the blasted pill. But faith was such a fragile thing. Again, the same question came to her. If the others find out what I'm using, if Marie uses her appraise skill on me, what will happen? Will I ever be able to help them again? That was another reason she detested the skill. If it could fail so easily, could she really rely on it as much as she was? It couldn't truly be relied on as a replacement for everything else. But all that was only part of the reason she didn't like the skill. The bigger part, the main part, was because of what it represented. What her class represented. What was a gutter doctor anyway? What did her hypocritical oath skill domain mean? Olivia took out her flask and drank down a quick gulp of the liquor. It stung at her throat, just like her class always stung at her. She didn't think the class's name really fit. She knew what it should really be called. It was why she hadn't gained a capstone skill yet. And why she gained new skills the way she gained. Maybe she did belong in the gutter because of it, but the name wasn't half enough to encompass what it meant. Olivia drank down a second gulp of the liquor and then watched her reflection in the bottle. She saw tired, sunken eyes. No, the better name for the class would have been Oathbreaker Doctor, because that was what she was. That was how she gained new skills. Once, not even so long ago really, she had sworn so many oaths. Because she had felt it was right. And then she had begun breaking them. Once, she had sworn to never withhold a patient treatment on demand of recompense. Then she had told a lord she would only help heal him if he agreed to her terms. She had leveled, and gained her medical contract skill. It had felt so right at the time, of course, so easy, but that didn't matter for oaths. Blackmailing the lord had been the obvious, right thing to do, but her class had cared not. It had branded her an oath-breaker yet again, and as always, rewarded her. Once, she had sworn to never lie to a patient. To never mislead them about their illness, even for the sake of hope or peace of mind. It had felt right to her. She never liked the false peace some gave, preferring the grim truth. Then, after Pelagni, she had gained her placebo skill, a thing built on those lies. She almost threw the bottle in her hand right at the wall. Because that one irked her the most of her skills, she didn't even know what lie she had told. She got up, sitting at the bedside, once more racking her brain. What did I do in Pelagni? What lie did I tell? I never misled anyone, at least not that I remember. I didn't lie. I really don't think I did. But her class had judged her, and so it had to be true. But still, she didn't know. It was the worst part. The lack of clarity. Oh yes, Olivia knew why she did not have a capstone skill. All those broken oaths, but none were enough yet for the class. Not grand enough, or sinful enough. What would it take? How far would she have to truly fall? Even the first one had not been enough, the one that had started it all. Her strongest skill too, perhaps, her transfer condition. The oath that had given her the class in the first place, the one that was the root and cause of all. Because, after breaking one oath, the rest became so much easier, right? That day was as clear in her mind as if it had all happened just yesterday. Olivia watched her reflection in the bottle, sitting in a room lit by grey light, and remembered. Olivia had spent her childhood on the other side of the channel which divided the monarchy, in a small village by the river Thames. She had been a sickly child, always ailing from one illness or another, and her family had been poor. Slowly but surely, her condition got worse and worse, as her family couldn't afford the treatment she needed. They had feared the worst. Until the doctor came. For her, there only ever would be one, the doctor. Sure, others shared his class, but that man would forever be the only one she would think of as the embodiment of the class itself. She remembered his kindly smile and playful eyes best. The rest of him was old, but that didn't really fit, so she remembered the eyes and smile. That man had arrived in their village, seen the 8-year-old girl's condition, and offered to treat her. For free. When her parents had asked for payment, the man had just laughed, a twinkle in his eye. What kind of doctor would I be if I were to leave a poor girl like these here? He had said, patting the young Olivia on the head. But he hadn't found a solution. Not immediately, at least. As Olivia had returned from his impromptu clinic to her parents, still coughing and skin pale, they had cried and hugged her. But then, the next day, the doctor came back. His smile had been reassuring. What kind of doctor gives up after only one attempt? So Olivia had gone with him that day too. And the next, and the one after that, and for the whole week the man had stayed in the village. Then he left the village, with great apologies to Olivia's parents, because he could not stay. He had duties and other patients to tend to. But, as he left the village, boarded his carriage, and began making his way back to the big city, Olivia followed along. For an 8-year-old girl, leaving her parents behind to live in a big, smelly, and scary city had been terrible. She had cried so much. But then the doctor had given her a sweet bit of candy to suck on, and patted her on the head. Still, even with the sweet snack in her mouth, Olivia had been doubtful. While the wagon shook and creaked on the winding road, she had looked up at the doctor and asked a question with the honesty of a child. Is there really a cure for me, Mr. Doctor? Can it be found in the big city? He had looked at her seriously and answered honestly because that man had never lied. I do not know, little Olivia. Not yet. But that is what science and medicine are all about. You work away at mysteries, finding new things and disproving old things. Then you teach what you learn to others, and they continue on. Year by year, progress happens. Eventually, everything will be known. Do you understand? And Olivia had nodded her heads because she really had. Her eyes had sparkled at those words. That had been the day she understood the first bit of being a doctor. Perhaps that had been the day she had decided she wanted to become one too. Knowledge she hadn't really thought of learning in school before, but now, suddenly, she found she hungered for it. I understand, Mr. That is good, but just one thing. My name is not Mr. or Doctor. Please. Call me Thomas. It took Thomas 2 years to find a cure for the young girl's ailment. Many measurements, many tinctures and herbs, many skills from colleagues with different types of doctor classes, but he did manage it. Olivia had never doubted him one bit. As she had drank that final tincture, hands shaking with nerves, she had looked up at the doctor's smiling face and felt fear. Not at the tincture not working, no. She had feared that it would work. And that she would have to leave. Because living with Thomas was just so much more interesting than her old life back in the village. No more practicing needlework to be a good housewife, no more helping in the fields for long days. Here, there were always new things to learn. New books to read. Maybe, just maybe, even new classes to get. But then the tincture had worked, and her pale complexion had slowly grown better, and her underdeveloped body had started growing as it was supposed to. She had spotted just a few tears in Thomas's eyes that day when he had thought that she wasn't looking. So, 2 weeks later, once timetables permitted, Thomas had taken her back to her parents. They had looked different than Olivia had remembered. She had clung to the doctor's long coat, not willing to let go, but the man had pried her off and walked away, still with that reassuring smile on her face. Olivia had looked at her parents then and found that their smiles were tense. Weary. She hugged her mother and got back to needlework the next day. A year later, she ran away. Stowing away on a carriage and nibbling at the scant bread she had taken along, Olivia managed to make her way to the city and went right back to the doctor's house, knocking at the door furiously at the break of dawn. It took Thomas a few minutes to answer, and Olivia had felt some pangs of fear that he would be gone. But then he had opened the door, protective gloves and mask on his face, evidently having just finished some procedure for the haggard beggar who was waiting in the back room. He had smiled at Olivia, and this time, Olivia had smiled right back. Her eyes had a fire in them. I want to learn and become a doctor too. Of course, there had been negotiations first. Tense negotiations back at the village with her parents and many hours of them scolding her for running away recklessly. But Olivia did eventually begin her studies back in the city, working alongside Thomas the oath-bound doctor, and only then did she truly find out how amazing her master was. And how vile other doctors were. She had never really thought about it, used to her village as she was, but Thomas's clinic wasn't a grand place. It was in the poorer part of town, a humble one-story building with 4 rooms in it. She met doctors much below her master in level who lived much grander. But they would only help if someone had money to pay. They didn't stop by beggars in the street to make sure they were all right, and they sneered at Thomas when he wasn't looking their way, but Olivia saw it. And so she asked, "Master, why don't you put those others in their place? They're not half as good as you are." Thomas had smiled at her, in a way her father never had. What good would it do? But think, young Olivia. The man we just spoke with, Dr. Creeley, he is 10 years my senior in age, but 10 years my junior in level. Do you think that is a coincidence? Let him talk, we have better things to do. And so, Olivia had begun to admire him more and more. For all the oaths he kept, and all the people he healed. Thomas never demanded payment, but many still paid what they could. He never turned away from a patient. He had sworn all that. And so, eventually, Olivia swore it too, because she wanted to be just like him one day. The path to the future was clear. Sure, Thomas wasn't the most affluent, but he did have connections and friends. Once she came of age and reached the appropriate level, he would sponsor her enrollment in the academy and arrange matters, so she could become a proper doctor. Time passed, Olivia gained her class and chose healer for herself, and continued learning. Every day, her conviction grew. Until the magical plague arrived, and the city was thrown into chaos. She remembered that fateful argument like it was yesterday. Because it was one of the few times she remembered Thomas not smiling. His eyes and mouth, again, were the only things she really remembered. You can't be serious, all the others are leaving. The royal doctor will be arriving in a week, they said. The man didn't respond to Olivia's words, just kept peeking out from behind the window's curtain, carefully surveying the street. Monitoring the situation. Because a plague had come, and he had said it would be getting worse. Right now it was mostly a bad flu, something that had started among the local factory workers. But a few people suddenly died from the illness, changing into something worse. Then, the dead had not stayed dead. And now people were trying to leave, rushing through quiet streets, eyes wary and jittering. But Thomas wasn't leaving. He closed the curtain, then looked back at Olivia, just a bit sad. "I can't leave, I'm sworn to help. And maybe, just maybe. You think you can cure it?" Olivia asked, eyes wide. He didn't nod. But he did smile. As I said, maybe. I haven't tried yet. Besides, remember your own case? How many tries did it take to get you healthy? Olivia took in air sharply, then hissed at the obstinate man. That wasn't an infectious monsterification disease. His eyes stayed steely. That only makes me staying more important. Lives are at stake. And besides, he looked out the window again, crouching low. Thomas lowered his voice. Leaving might not be so easy. There were sounds of magic explosions in the distance, and then rushing footsteps outside the window. Olivia gulped. The quarantine has started. But she calmed her thundering heart, and crossed her arms, giving the man a triumphant look. Then I'm not leaving either. You'll need help here, right? His eyes snapped back to her. No. It's too dangerous. Thomas said, voice firm. You just said leaving won't be easy. Olivia pointed out. Thomas gritted his teeth. I can get one person out, I know people. But you're not staying. Olivia backed off, ready to bolt. No, I refuse. Don't make this difficult. You're the one making it difficult. Thomas's expression shifted then, and Olivia saw him pained for the first time. Because a doctor's duty and a father's had conflicts. His dark eyes looked at the young girl standing before him, full of defiance. And then he deflated, looking away. We'll see. Olivia did not see his expression but thought she had won the argument. They went on with the day, the doctor making preparations with his protective gear and equipment, and Olivia poring over countless books on prior magical plagues. Details were scarce. The last one had been decades ago. And so she went to sleep, in the room that had become her own, where the window had already been boarded shut for safety's sake. When she woke up the next morning, the door wouldn't open. She banged on it, and soon the doctor woke up to explain. It was simply too risky, much too risky for her to come close to anybody diseased. He would bring her meals and ward off the doors. But he would not risk her to the disease. Olivia faced house arrest. She just had to wait, and things would be resolved without her. This is absurd. You can't do this. I can, and I am sworn to. It's too risky. Of course, she had considered breaking out through the window, for a moment. Then she heard the noises from outside. Sounds of things getting worse, and after peeking through the boards just a bit she had seen the changes. People were no longer rushing about, now they were huddling indoors, barricading themselves off to wait things out. And if she were to make any sudden noises. Olivia saw something human-shaped running at the edge of her vision, on 4 legs. But when she snapped her eyes there, it was gone. She stumbled back from the window, fell back on her messy bed, and then just stopped. Does this really make sense? Why is he doing it like this? She had asked, pondering in the bed. It still felt too dangerous in a way. Surely he could have just forced her out, or done something to make her go away. Why go on with the house arrest ploy? Then she had sat up, eyes wide with realization. Maybe he can't. Because of his oaths. After all, her master wasn't an ordinary healer class, but an oath-bound doctor. Olivia had looked at the door, wondering. What options does he have? If I do break out or do something rash, would that impact his oaths? Startled, she realized that she could never risk something like that. Sighing, Olivia had laid back in her bed to wait, mindlessly flipping through her textbooks every now and then. And she listened. Despite what was happening outdoors, the doctor still managed to get supplies in and out through some contacts of his, and even brought in some patients. Olivia heard them pleading with the man for aid, and she also heard how Thomas reassured them he would try his best. A few days passed, and gradually the talk quieted. When Thomas next brought her meal, clad in a thick protective coat and a mask over his mouth and nose, he opened the door for a brief moment to pass the meal through. Olivia caught darkness in his eyes. The patients who had come hadn't made it. Not exchanging words that day, the door had closed. And more patients came on the morrow. Olivia wasn't quite sure how much time passed like that, the doctor working at his patients while she was locked down for her own sake, but life went on. She chatted with him through the door every morning and evening and briefly saw his face when he gave meals. She didn't try to make a run for it or anything, she was resigned. What would be the point? She had been only a level 8 healer anyway. There was no way she could really help. So she waited and listened. Until one day, with one patient, the doctor had sounded ragged in their evening talk. His voice hadn't come as clear as it used to. He did not speak as much as he usually did. In the brief opening of the door, he had been wearing a coat double as thick as the prior day, and his face was covered wholly by a mask. The next day, he did not arrive to bring her food in the morning. Olivia waited, pacing in her room, listening. She heard muffled sounds, maybe yells, but not the voice she was waiting for. She didn't hesitate long. Olivia broke down her door. It took her a while. The thing was made of sturdy wood, but with a sharp blade in hand, she pried nails out one by one, pulled the boards off with frantic energy, then squeezed out of the gap she had formed. Scrambling, she rushed through the eerie house, noting how things in the main hall and entrance area seemed fine, but she didn't see Thomas. So she went to the place where the sound was coming from, the only place where he could be. The treatment room. Feeling a growing dread, Olivia walked toward the room, until she almost jumped at the door, then pulled it open. Her eyes widened. Two men, two faces that would forever be burned in her mind. The room had used to only have one central chair for a patient to sit in and a bed by the far edge for rest, but things had been rearranged. The bed had been taken out, and two heavily built wooden chairs were laid at the back, on opposite sides of the room, so those seated could stare each other in the eye. And, gulping, Olivia's eyes went to the rightmost chair. The one where no noise was coming from. Thomas, chained to the chair with an iron manacle, just like a patient of the disease should be handled. Had to have done it himself, Olivia's analytical side said. But her basic diagnosis had a clear verdict. Not alive. But not undead either. His face was marred with pale blotches like running footsteps, as if the disease had been forced to race to claim him. But the doctor had been faster, and as the empty vial by his feet proved, managed to keep himself from whatever the disease had planned. But his face, lifeless and pale thought it was still smiling. But it was a farce, a grim facsimile engineered by death. And the culprit? Olivia's eyes finally went to the other side of the room, to the other chair, to the man seated there. The living man. She finally registered the words he was shouting. Have to let me go from here, that fool didn't. He was trashing against the chair, clutching at the chains shackling him to it. Olivia didn't really parse the meaning of his words. She had just stared at a healthy man, but one who still bore markings of being recently ill. Basic diagnosis revealed his condition. Recovering. The young girl breathed in and felt an anger build. Because the man's red face seemed angry, if anything, not grateful. The doctor had managed to save him, getting infected himself in the process. But for what? Thomas had been such a great man. But the man who had been his death. Olivia had felt fury then, because that one had seemed so lesser in comparison. Not worthwhile at all. Back in the present, Olivia looked long at the bottle in her hand. Those were the two faces she remembered. The doctor, lifeless, and the patient, living. It was that moment that stung her with regret and had set her on this path. Because Olivia had never freed him. She hadn't been able to take one step further into the room. The young woman had just stood in that doorway, feeling a burning anger and horror, then turned away. Ran away. She didn't remember much after that. A long week sneaking in a city of shadows and death, and the sudden recovery by the men dressed in red and return to normalcy after. But she had never gone back, never could go back. And only later had she begun to remember that moment, and began to wonder. What had happened to that man in the chair? Had she doomed him to a steady death of dehydration or something worse? Had somebody arrived to save him? She didn't know. But that had been her first sin. Once, speaking with the doctor, the real one, she had sworn with him to never turn away from a patient in need. And yet in that moment, she had just walked away. Years later, when she had finally reached level 15 after grueling effort, she had only had one real doctor class available, as if it had been waiting for her from that moment, with the skill to mark her oath. Had that man lived? Did it matter? Probably not anymore. The past was past, and Olivia once more felt the bottle calling to her. But this time, as she watched the bottle in her hands, she looked at herself. What did her own face look like? Not like Thomas's had, surely. She wasn't so bright, so dazzling of a person. But still, as she traced the lines of her own face on the bottle, there was something similar there. A smile. That shocked her for a moment. Am I really smiling now of all times? It's really not. But then she looked again and saw it was a different smile. Not quite warm and comforting like that great man's own had been, but there was that one final bit that completed the smile. The key bit that Olivia had inherited. Audaciousness. Yes, that was what her own smile, darker thought it was, shared with that man. He had dared live an audacious life, mocking all other doctors. And Olivia had only gone further. Chuckling, she put the bottle away. She didn't drink from it, because she had better things to do. Olivia stood up, some more resolve in her eyes. Sure, she didn't have her level 20 capstone quite yet, and she feared what she would have to do to get one. Olivia had never sworn an oath to not kill, but there were so many others to break. But she had something else now too. More than just broken oaths. Olivia reached into her pocket and took out one of her pills. She looked it over, marveling at how dark and foreboding she had managed to make it. She had a cure. Olivia snapped her hand closed and started striding for the door, to make her way back to the main hall. Enough moping around, there's work to do. So, what if it's not the knowledge I seek? A cure is a cure. Could she really pretend her way to curing a magical plague? Olivia smiled because she wanted to find out too. Chapter 78 Appropriate Blame. Fayette watched the hubbub in the medical hall from a good distance away, wondering what was going on. Lots of people were rushing in and out, and a lot of noise was coming from inside, but she couldn't really properly see without heading in. Is what Olivia did really that strange? At least she had her eavesdrop, which had let her keep somewhat on track of what was happening. And kept her distracted. She wasn't really in the mood to think too deeply on matters, slightly unsettled as she was by her talk with Marie. So, for the last few hours, Fayette had mainly just dallied about, watching builders rush to fortify the wall separating the docks from the rest of the island and the mages who were huddled in conference. Her other friends were up to their own things, and Fayette really wasn't in the mood to talk. She wasn't in the mood to listen that much either, but what else was there to do? The hunter's bit of the job was over for today at least. Fayette sighed and began heading back to the harbor side, to watch the waves roll about as the sun crept down. Maybe I should handle my skill distribution now. Her mind was mostly clear, so it felt like the best use of her time. Having used a lot of her skill points for Made sense, she had only her 2 new ones to use for the moment. And thinking of how the fights had gone, Fayette realized what she was lacking. Range. What I need here is range. Her feet brought her to the landing zone, where more gondolas were ferrying about, and Fayette stopped to watch the opposite shore. There was a sparse crowd of guards and civilian spectators there, watching with equal curiosity and wariness. The distance was not that far away for legs, but still as good as an uncrossable abyss for the plague. None of the zombies had seemed inclined to swim at least yet. She was similar in a way. It was annoying to wear her plague mask, but getting infected would be even more annoying even if Olivia was able to cure it. These disease things are nasty to fight up close, especially as we're supposed to avoid all contact with bare skin. But I don't have any good options for long range at all. She could use sweep dust, but not all enemies cared about that, and it was more distraction than damage. Most of her other options were melee, from her broom handling to more specialized skills like dry laundry. Perhaps if her magic training were further along, that may have helped, but things being as they were, she only really had one choice. Fayette reached into her apron and took out a fork. It was fine quality, a gleaming and sturdy bit of metal, and as she squinted at it. Wait a minute, I don't think this is from my original manor at all. We didn't have ones as nice as this. When did I pick this up? Holding it up, the sun glimmered along the surface, making the fork sparkle like a magic artifact. Fayette narrowed her eyes. Maybe at a row? Did I pick this up while at that office building we burned? It is pretty shiny, so I may have done it subconsciously. Shrugging, she held it firmer in her hand, then bent it back for a throw as if she were pitching a dart. She aimed at the ocean. Then looked at the shiny fork in her hand. Fayette paused. Wait a minute, this is way too nice to waste on this. She quickly swapped the nice fork for a rusty spoon, then readied her throw again. Her arm swung, and the spoon was flung over the ocean. Cutlery control began to assist, then quickly faded as the spoon went out of its 4-meter range. Fayette focused on the fork, trying to get a measure of its speed and strength. It splashed against the ocean a pretty good distance away. And Fayette realized she didn't really know how far away that had been. Was that a street's length or something? At least it was a pretty decent throw, went right where I was aiming. But how much stopping power does that really have? It didn't go that far. From her experience, her knives and forks tended to do decent damage if they hit vital spots like eyes, but otherwise, their performance was a bit lacking. The skill was more about precision than power. But did it have to stay that way? Marie said that you can influence a skill's evolution if you train it somehow. Maybe I should try to throw forks around as hard as I can? It might become a power-type skill then. I was only a maid when I got it, not a combat maid, so I suppose making it more combat-oriented wouldn't be that difficult. Already it had saved her in quite a few spots, all with only one skill point invested. She had never felt like more had been necessary, and there had always been lots of other skills to pursue, but right now it was her only real ranged option. Turning away from the ocean, Fayette nodded and made her decision. Skill up, cutlery control has reached rank 2. Just one skill point for now, she wanted to keep her other one in reserve in case she unlocked anything new. Closing her eyes, Fayette focused on the newly upgraded skill, feeling for any changes in it. Mostly seems like the range got bigger, by about half maybe? Did the power increase? Taking another of her bad forks from her apron, she spun around and flung it at the ocean. Then she opened her eyes. And saw that her fork was headed right for a boat that was approaching. And her maid sense screamed that there were some very important people on that boat. Wait, no. Lightning fast, Fayette took out her broom and began sweeping the grounds nonchalantly, activating her unseen attendant. She followed the fork's flight with a side eye. It reached the boat, then was deflected off harmlessly against a very dangerous-looking man's shield. Fayette tensed a bit, but kept sweeping, trying to seem as innocent as possible. She felt the shielder man's eyes near her and then they passed by, going to the side. She breathed a sigh of relief. Looks like I'm clear. Then she took another look at the approaching boat, finally taking note of its extravagance. It was a boat of milk-white wood twice as large as the others, decorated with golden icons of clouds and thunderbolts. The mages were gathering to receive the boat by the dock. And Fayette watched, wondering why the archbishop had arrived here of all places. She found out very soon, as the hunters were all called together for a meeting by the main square, which had already been cleansed of any marks of decay. A wooden podium had even been erected, and the newly arrived archbishop loomed there, his face grave. Fayette stood in the crowd of hunters, with the rest of her party around her. Except for Olivia, the doctor was still working with the patients. Mireille had apparently been fetching the monster cores from the monsters they had slain, having confirmed from Olivia that they were safe to handle. Fayette sensed their radiating power from the seamstress's pockets, and the little spider Char seemed to sense them too, seeing as she was careful to stay on Mireille's right shoulder, as far from the offending pocket as possible. I wonder what she's going to do with those? Even wanted my portion. Then Fayette heard a clap of noise, and looking up at the podium, saw Cadeau, the mage in charge here, standing in front of the archbishop. He had just slammed his fists into the table, and all talk in the square had quieted, gazes going to him. Everyone, it is my delight to announce that Archbishop Villefort has arrived to bless our venture, as well as enlighten us on some matters of great import. He paused to breathe in, then stepped to the side, gesturing the richly dressed priest forward. Please, Father, take the stage. It was Fayette's first time seeing the archbishop from this close, and only now did it hit her how old he was. Deep lines crisscrossed his face, and the thin hair beneath his blue zucchetto cap was snow white. To her maid sense he felt solemn and fragile, like someone not to be disturbed when in motion. And that motion was very slow indeed, as the old man took a generous half-minute to even climb up the podium. What do you think he's going to say? Fayette whispered, tiptoeing closer to Marie, who had been standing just a bit in front. I think I have some idea, Marie answered, keeping her eyes fixed on the man as if measuring him out as a foe. Do you remember that meeting he went to, with the other two? With the Lord of Industry, and the Grand Magus? Fayette asked. Marie nodded. Those three. If people like that meet, something important gets discussed. Something our sort is not always privy to. I think we're about to hear one result of that discussion. Fayette hummed in thought, mind less on the actual speech to come and more on the fact that Marie didn't seem to be in a melancholy mood anymore. Her proud face was settled into lady mode now, and Fayette thought it suited her noble face a lot better than somberness. Though the somberness did have its own appeal now that I think. Citizens. Men and women of the faith. A loud voice suddenly boomed, and Fayette found her attention forcibly dragged up to the podium. Some force kept her there, watching. The priest stood above the crowd like a father of all, looking down at his pupils with wisdom. You have done well in making the first strike against this epidemic here. Tragedy has struck, but as always, the brave men and women of the monarchy have been ready to struggle against it," he said, smiling with pride. Even Fayette felt herself growing somewhat pleased at the thought. But then, the Archbishop's eyes turned stormy with the suddenness of a thunderclap. However, his voice rumbled. "It is not all pleasant news for today." Fayette tensed. "Is something nastier on the way?" The man waited for just the right amount of time, letting the anticipation build. "In our investigations today, our specialists have found out the source of this illness." The source? Fayette hadn't really put any thought into that particular subject until now, and suddenly she found herself very interested. "Are we going to clean it?" As some of you may know, this isn't the only epidemic being fought back right now. Treacherous saboteurs from the Nordic Union unleashed a plague of much graver proportion in our Bengal colony, and, is it a coincidence that another one starts here, right now when the royal doctor is unavailable to help? Fayette's breath caught. A gasp of outrage went through the crowd. The old man nodded, eyes grave. "Yes, our men found the evidence today. This was all another attack on us by the scum up north," he said, almost hissing the last words. "But fret not, for Grand Magus Mondaug will resolve everything in a few days, once he finishes his preparations. Until then," his gaze dragged over the gathered crowd until he finally nodded with approval. "We will count on your continued assistance. Blessing of the faithful upon you all." With those words, he left the podium and the crowd erupted in an uproar, feeling a balm of prayer wiping away their tiredness. "Can you believe that? People did all this?" Fayette asked Marie, feeling the fresh outrage coursing through her veins. But when she turned to the blonde lady, it was not a face of anger Marie bore. No, her face hadn't changed at all from what it had been before the speech. Measuring, weighing. Her eyes were not even on the podium, but rather on some of the scribes standing off to the side, recording every word said in a hurry. Fayette instantly felt herself calm down. Marie? Aren't we supposed to be angry here?" The lady's eyes took a quick look at Fayette's confusion and seemed to brighten from their gloom. "No, you're right about that," Marie said, turning to walk away. "I think we are supposed to be very angry indeed. But you aren't." Marie was silent for a moment, and Fayette hurried to follow her. The lady didn't betray her opinion from her bearing, and Fayette hurriedly calmed her own face too. "She's walking towards..." "Oh. The hospital?" Marie noticed Fayette's eyes and nodded. "We're not really the experts on this, are we? First, let's go ask Olivia for her opinion." "That does seem sensible." "Mireille, stop fiddling with those cores before we leave you here. Are you poking them with needles?" "Sounds like bullshit to me," Olivia said. Fayette stared. Marie and Mireille did too. They shared a quick glance, an instant communication passing between them all. So blunt. Then they all turned back to the doctor, who was washing her hands in a basin after a busy day of work. The back room they were crammed in was dark and the air smelled moldy, but that all paled in comparison to the mood Olivia was giving off. Just to elaborate, Marie started, unnerved by Olivia seeming satisfied with that for an explanation. "What makes you so sure about that?" The doctor finished getting her hands clean, emptied the now murky water-filled basin out the window, then started toweling her hands dry. She was scowling and muttering. Of course, they would do something like that, just as. "Sorry, Olivia," Marie repeated, louder this time. Olivia turned and flinched as if she had forgotten her friends were waiting for her in the room and rubbed her eyes. The dark pouches under them seemed deeper. "Sorry, it's been a long day." She sighed, threw the towel down onto the floor, then collapsed into the chair waiting behind her. "It's not that complicated of a thing, really. Remember what I was trying to say to you at first, Fayette? Before we got interrupted with the innkeeper murderer thing." Fayette snapped her fingers. "Ah, that's right. You had suspicions something was up here before the news of the quarantine came, right?" She squinted suspiciously at the gloomy doctor. "How did you know that?" Olivia didn't quite smile, but she gave off some sense of satisfaction at that, and nodded. "Indeed, I had suspicions. I read a lot of newspapers, trying to keep abreast of what's happening where and why, and I saw a mention of something happening here that concerned me. Some precursor disease going around, or what?" "I don't think that type of news is covered too often," Marie asked, curious. Olivia shook her head. "Not the infections or sickness itself, but the effect it has. There was news of the factories here shutting down because there was a sickness going out among the workers. I wasn't sure of course, but prior incidents have started in similar conditions. What makes you so sure it's not intentional sabotage then? Mireille asked. It's not sure of course, just a hunch. But I told you how these things start, didn't I? Factories are places especially prone to mana mishaps. And if some saboteur were behind it, would they really target this of all places? Olivia said, then pointed out the window. Fayette followed her gesture and saw the lapping waters surrounding the island. Right island. Not the best place to spread it far, is it? Fayette asked. Olivia nodded. Of course, even on the more flat ground, these illnesses don't spread that quickly. They tend to be rather local due to the difficulties of mana spread. But this place? Would hardly be my first choice. It made some sense to Fayette. Sure, the island had shipyards that were important, but from the look of things, those would be recovered relatively unscathed. I could probably manage much better sabotage if it were up to me. First, start the plague, then set the place on fire in the ensuing panic and then wait. Why am I thinking through this? Fayette frowned, then turned to the others. So they're making an excuse with this whole saboteur story. Marie shrugged. Maybe. It's good politics for sure. Official explanations always have to be given, and it's much better if the blame can be put somewhere useful. Not sure I like that idea, Fayette though. She liked to know the truths behind such matters, and deception didn't feel right. Because if the disease did have a true origin, should it not be uncovered and dealt with? Do the government people even know or care about it themselves? Do they need to in order to put an end to things? The Archbishop had seemed confident about things coming to an end in only a few days, and as she thought about it, an idea began to form. Fayette looked at the room's other window, the one not facing the ocean, but rather the wall which separated the shipyard peninsula from the rest of the island. It almost called to her. Because, well, if there was an origin to this whole magical disease thing somewhere out there, and the government people weren't interested in it, perhaps a maid could clean it up? Fayette licked her lips, thinking of the experience she could get from that. Yes, that should work fine indeed. She looked up, seeing that the others were discussing the matter quietly. How is the work going for you, Olivia? Some patients recover faster, but most look like it might take them over a week. I think it will get faster as I go through, and... Fayette clapped her hands. Sorry, everyone. I have an idea. 3 faces turned to her, with a variety of expressions. Oh no, she has an idea, Mireille cursed. Is it troublesome? Olivia asked, curious. What is your idea? Marie asked with a smile. Fayette gave Mireille a quick glare, then relaxed and began. Well, I don't really like this whole they're not telling us the full picture situation we've got here. I want to know what's really going on. Anybody with me? Sounds a bit risky, as we might step on some toes, Mireille said, frowning. That is true, knowledge can be dangerous but, the truth matters too, I think, Marie said. The lady turned to the side, toward Olivia. But I will defer to Olivia, I think. She has the most insight on this, and perhaps the right to the truth too. Olivia sighed, but then pushed herself up from the chair as if getting ready for action. Her eyes were sharp. I guess. I do want to know. Assigning blame is a key part of a truly comprehensive diagnosis, one might say. Fayette nodded, and nodded some more, as she grew a tad excited at the prospect. She finally turned back to Mireille, making a poor attempt at pleading eyes. How about it, Mir? Don't you want to know too? The seamstress looked conflicted for a bit, face locked in a tense grimace, but eventually, she relaxed and sighed. Fine, we'll do it your way. Might be worth it in it end. But, she stood up straighter. I don't want to be the one who has to sell this to the people in charge. Somebody else do the convincing. Reasonable, Fayette said, happy she got her way. But the day was already drawing near night, and dealing with matters like these in the dark of night didn't appeal to her that much. Tomorrow morning then? Let's go talk with that Cadeau fellow and see if we can go poke around in town. Chapter 79 Delving in. Mireille did end up having to be the one doing the convincing. It had been a simple process of elimination really. Olivia was stuck doing proper doctor work for the day, it would be risky to have Marie act too ladylike right now, and Fayette. Well. That one didn't need much additional explanation. The hunters had all been called up in the morning to the square, where the man in charge, Cadeau, had given simple instructions. Most wouldn't have to do anything today, merely stand ready in case anything went wrong, while others would accompany mages further into the city for some sorts of preparations. Fayette's party was assigned to standby duty. The more relaxed orders had a calming effect on most of the hunters, and only few were actively wearing their plague masks now. Even Fayette's party only wore theirs strapped around the neck, so that they could be pulled back up at a moment's notice. So, as the others dispersed to rest for the day or to tend to their duties, it was only their party who remained on the square. Cadeau had begun to walk off back to his quarters, but seeing them waiting for him, he paused, a questioning look on his face. "You have something to ask?" Fayette studied the man with her maid sense, feeling puzzled. His class itself felt normal enough, like most of the other mages did, but there was an odd twist to it. She realized what it was when she saw that the man didn't have a plague mask anywhere on him, only a cross of the faith at his neck. A cross which seemed to emanate a class of its own, like an ornament stapled onto the man's proper class. "What the heck is that?" Mireille didn't notice what Fayette did, and only nodded at the man. "Sir, we were just wondering, aren't you going to send out any of us inside the city, just to help the civilians trapped in their homes? With how some patients have been successfully healed, shouldn't we be collecting civilians here?" It was something they actually did want to do, and were curious about, so they had decided to use the pretense of saving civilians as a cover for investigating matters more on their own. The toad-faced man grimaced, as if he had swallowed something foul. He sighed, crossing his arms. "I've had a word with the doctors on matters, and it's too soon to say whether the supposed cure is actually a long-term solution. A lot of the recoveries are a tad dubious, and proper oversight to make sure there are no errors will take weeks. I'm not wasting that time." Fayette felt a sting of anger, but reined it in, letting Mireille handle this one. Not that the seamstress was feeling any less insulted by the words, of course her brow was very furrowed. Still Mireille tried, "Wouldn't it be all right to save at least some civilians? If you are against bringing more potential infected in, we can have a doctor verify any we let in." "I fail to see the benefit of this," Cadeau snapped. "Grand Magus Mondaug will purge the disease within 2 days. He has matters in hand much better than any of the doctors here could. That is the end of it. The civilians have held on for this long, they can last a few more days. Is the Grand Magus really that good?" Fayette had some doubts, but the man didn't seem to want to budge at all. Mireille shrank down, biting any scathing remarks on her tongue, but it was Marie who came to the rescue. The lady stepped forward, a cunning twinkle in her eye. "Sir, with matters like this, it's not only the practicalities that matter, one must also consider the optics. How will your role in this look if you let a superior handle everything? Rescuing some civilians, it would surely lead to..." She didn't say the last words, just motioning her arm at the man, and that let him fill the gap. "Reputation and initiative, I see," he muttered. The mage looked up at Marie, more careful now, curious. "You do have keen insight, Hunter. Perhaps there is value in this." He went silent for a good 2 minutes, mumbling silently to himself, running a calculus only he knew. Finally, he snapped his fingers and his eyes focused back on Fayette's party, or more specifically, Marie. "I'll allow it. I'll arrange the matter on this side. Do well in this, and I may see you rewarded. Do you know the way to the city?" Mireille answered him with a nod. "I believe the party Mousetrap were in charge of monitoring that underground passage? We've talked with them." The mage gave a curt, almost military nod. "Excellent. Do this operation of mine today, the sooner the better." With that, he began to walk off, but Fayette still caught his mutterings on her eavesdrop. "We'll have to arrange the scribes, and get the proper news out for this." "What a guy," Fayette simply said, once he was far enough away. She shook her head, then gave Marie a disbelieving look. "Was he really that easy to manipulate? You didn't use some secret lady skill, did you?" Marie sighed. "I had hoped to stay a bit more discreet, but men like him, you just have to consider his perspective. It's pretty evident from how he's acting this is the first time he's really been granted authority, but it's not truly his. Any method to fortify that grasp. And he'll take it, even if it's offered in such a blatant way," Fayette finished. The lady smiled, "Exactly. That is the first time I've managed to be so convincing actually. She looks cute when she's being all proud," Fayette thought. Then she looked to the side and saw Mireille's pout. Somehow, Marie's cute looks a lot more adult than Mireille's cute. The seamstress finally snapped. You really made me start that conversation when I specifically asked not to, then solved the thing in the end anyway. Mireille grumbled. Marie gave an apologetic bow. Sorry, I had hoped he would bend easier. Enough bickering, Fayette said. She reached into her apron, taking a broom into hand. We've got work to do. As the whole point in securing the shipyard and fortifying its wall was to make a safe haven from the plague, naturally entrance into the city proper beyond wouldn't just be done by simply opening the big gate. Too many risks of mishaps that way. Luckily, the people who had first built the shipyard had shown foresight, and arranged for a hidden tunnel under the wall. It was inside the small shack housing the entryway there that Fayette, Marie, and Mireille encountered two of the three Mousetrap members again, ostensibly keeping a close guard. In reality, the party were busy playing cards, with one of the doctors as the third player. Oh, didn't know more folks would be heading through this morning. Edmund boomed, slamming his cards down onto the table. Hey, I was just about to win this round. Louis complained, but he nodded at the girls too. Good to see ya. The doctor's not with you today. She's a bit busy with the whole try to cure the plague thing, understandably, Mireille said, rolling her eyes. Is she really managing that? I thought it was an exaggeration. The doctor at the table said, laying down his cards. He was a man probably above 30, judging by the lines on his face, but he didn't feel that high level to Fayette. If you doubt her abilities, go see for yourself, she snapped, giving him her signature glare. Maybe I can make that into a skill. Hey! I'm doing an important job here. I've got to check everyone who comes through for signs of disease. He answered, frowning. His eyes focused for a moment, and Fayette felt some sort of pulse go through her. You three are clear at least. Of course we're clear, we're going from the inside to the outside, Mireille said, rubbing her forehead. Just. We need to pass through to the city. Can you let us through? Give me a moment, Edmund said, then got up from the table. The broad-shouldered hunter walked to the room's back and rolled a thick carpet to the side, showing the trapdoor that had been underneath. He unlocked the bolt on it, revealing a ladder leading down. Do you need a light for navigation? The tunnel is dark. Fayette looked at Mireille questioningly, but the seamstress shook her head. These two have decent vision skills, we'll manage. Good luck then you three, make sure you don't get infected. Say hi to Mark for us, he's watching the other end. So that's the third one's name. Will do, Fayette said, pulling her plague mask up to cover her face, then climbed down first. It was dark and damp, but with her made sense she got a general measure of the layout and moved a few steps forward. Mireille followed soon after, with Marie coming in last. Fayette's right hand was busy balancing her broom and bucket, so she held her left hand back, letting Mireille grab onto it for guidance, then started leading the way. They walked in silence, the tunnel sloping upward steadily. It had been a good few weeks since Fayette had last been in almost complete darkness down in the mines, but she found her steps surprisingly steady. Is this one of those skills you never forget, a result of the skill upgrade, or have I just gotten better? Whatever the case, it pleased her to feel stronger than before. If a giant spider were to jump at me right now, I bet I could sense it coming easily. Wait, is that a jinx? Fayette, why have you stopped? Mireille asked. I'm waiting to see if a giant spider attacks me, she answered. Giant spiders! Mireille and Marie both shouted, jolting back from Fayette. Relax. They're not actually here. It was just a hypothetical. After a moment of silence, Mireille found Fayette's outstretched left hand again, taking it back into her grip. But she gave it a bit of a squeeze, nails biting in. Don't joke around with giant spiders. She hissed. Seriously, Marie said, voice shaking a bit. I've had enough of those for a lifetime, except Char of course, if she grows that big. Fayette shook her head and continued walking forward. No sense of humor. Soon she sensed the tunnel coming to an end and gave the door at its end a curt knock. It opened, revealing a lanky man, pointing a crossbow their way. Fayette smiled at the crossbow. Hi, Edmund told us to say hello for his sake too. The man didn't say a word, just looked them over quickly, then pointed a finger down, deactivating some trap skills that Fayette hadn't even realized were there. He stood to the side, seeming to fade against the wall through some camouflage skill, then waved them forward. Pull the silent guy act then. Fayette shook her head and walked through, finding herself in a dimly lit storage warehouse of sorts, though it seemed to be empty of any inventory. Her nose twitched at the smell of stale rat droppings and her brow creased as her maid sense felt the dust all over, and she began to reach into her apron. Then Mireille squeezed her hand again hard. "Faye, rein yourself in. We're not taking a cleaning break here. Just a little one." Fayette tried, looking back, but Mireille's face, mouth, and nose hidden by the mask, was iron. Marie just seemed amused. "You dusted our rooms just a few hours ago. That not enough? Are they still mad about the spider thing?" "Fine, have it your way," Fayette said, snapping her hand out of Mireille's grip. Looking at the wall, she saw that the door to the tunnel had already closed, and the man guarding it had faded away somewhere. Even with her maid sense, she couldn't feel him at all. "I might need more ranks in that one if it's that easy to evade. Let's move out." First, the three quietly walked to the broken windows at one edge of the warehouse, then peeked outside, careful to not raise their heads up too high. What they saw was a thick forest of brick buildings, once painted in brilliant and pristine colors, but now in a slight state of decay. Windows were either broken or boarded shut, and Fayette got a dim sense of life forms all over. There were corpses on the ground, but some were still twitching as if they might spring to motion at any moment. But mostly things seemed oddly calm. Especially if the place was supposed to be as infested with monsters as the shipyard had been. "Where are all the monsters?" "I don't see as many as I should," Fayette asked quietly, scanning the street. The few standing figures she did see stuck to the shadowy alleys, moving in hunched postures. "We're still near to the shipyard's wall. The hunters were saying a lot of them have been attracted there in a big pack by all the racket," Mireille said. "We'll probably be a lot thicker on the streets as we get closer to the factory area." Fayette nodded, and thought she spied a bit of movement through the boards in one house. A curtain being closed, or perhaps opened, it was hard to see at this distance. People were out there even if they were not all quite alive as they should be. She ran her eyes across the view, running a quick count at the windows. Guess the boarded up places still have people hiding away inside, while the broken up places not so much. How fast did it all happen here? If the sound and activity by the shipyard have attracted their attention, won't us fighting through the streets do the same? Fayette asked, backing away from the window. We'll get bogged down completely if they start coming through in numbers. How are the other parties managing? Marie asked. It's not like we're the only ones out here. Probably some specialized stealth abilities or artifacts and help from the mages, Mireille said, pacing in a circle. Not something we can count on. With the situation like this, we could try the roofs. Fayette offered, shrugging her shoulders. She pointed out the window, indicating the closely built housing. With our skills, I don't think making our way up top would be that difficult. If anything, the monsters seem to dislike sunlight, so I doubt we'll run into many up there. Mireille was nodding, hand on her chin. That could work. Marie, does your magic work on roof tiles? I think so. But making bridges or something of the sort might make a bit too much noise. I don't suppose control conversation could silence something like that? Fayette asked. The lady shook her head. Not without one more upgrade to the skill at least. But I don't think it matters, the alleys don't seem that wide. I can jump over. Fayette couldn't quite resist the temptation and decided to tease her just a bit. You've kept up to my exercise regimen then? Just a few days ago you were getting left behind on the march. That was different. The lady huffed, crossing her arms. I can handle a few rooftops. Her pouting is quite endearing. I wonder if ladies can get a skill for that? Fayette nodded, then walked closer, patting her on the shoulder. I'll make sure to catch you if there's any trouble. Sure. Thanks. Marie replied, voice oddly wooden. Fayette gave her an odd look. Is she actually nervous about this? Well, if she wants to put on a brave front, I guess I shouldn't break it. Let's get onto the roof. Conveniently, the warehouse had a ladder leading right up to the rooftop, so soon the party was up top, basking in the plentiful autumn sunlight. Fayette shielded her eyes from the light with her left hand, balancing her broom and bucket in the right. Getting them up the ladder had been a pain. The factory place is that way, right? Mireille looked at the tall chimneys Fayette was pointing at and sighed. What do you think, Faye? Of course it's the damned. Wait, I hear something, Fayette suddenly said, holding up a hand. Her eavesdrop, cast wide from the rooftop, had caught something, and now her eyes circled like hawks, trying to pinpoint the location. Somewhere over there I think that sound has to be. What is it, Fayette? Marie asked, concerned at how serious the maid looked. Need to move, hold this, Fayette answered, handing her bucket of slime to a startled Mireille. Then she was running fast. Her eavesdrop sharpened as she accelerated, confirming her impression of the location. Moving just over there. She jumped off the warehouse's roof, landed on the next building over, then kept moving, pumping her hands. Holding the broom slowed her a bit, but based on what she heard, she couldn't afford to put it away either. She heard footsteps, many footsteps all running. Many stomped hard, rushing through alleyways in a clatter of broken bottles and boxes. But the ones leading were soft and light, a child's steps. Fayette ran faster. 2 buildings forward, over there. Fayette jumped to the next rooftop, a less wide building, then kept her momentum, hopping right over to the next, not slowing one bit. She heard the sounds without the skill, now a chase. But it wasn't just from one direction, she heard one set of footsteps approaching from the opposite end of the alley too. About to be cornered. The maid rushed to the edge of the roof, and finally spotted her quarry, hurrying down an alleyway. A child, dressed in a grimy black outfit, was rushing down the alley in a mad dash, clutching 2 loaves of bread in his arms. 2 ghouls and 2 zombies were chasing him, almost nipping at his heels. And 1 more ghoul was circling from the side for an ambush. The boy rounded the building's corner, saw the ghoul waiting in ambush right after, and tried to skid to a stop, too slow to stop his own momentum. The loaves of bread fell from his hands to the ground as he stumbled down, scraping his arms on the ground. The ghoul in front jumped at him. And a maid fell down onto the ghoul. Fayette brought her broom down with her fall in a devastating plunging attack and crushed the ghoul's face right in, and the monster burst into blood. The young boy watched with wide eyes as Fayette then activated her magic, and the cascade of blood seemed to miraculously circle right around them. In a panic, he began to stand up, remembering the chase right at his heels. "Miss, there's..." "I know," Fayette said, already moving over the boy's prone form. She stepped over him, right as the monsters came around the corner, and threw a set of forks at the group. Her aim hit eyes and wrists, slowing the zombie types, but the ghouls shrugged the blows off as if they were nothing. "I really need an upgrade for that," Fayette thought, but her body was already moving. Another step forward, and her broom smashed into the first ghoul barreling at her, resulting in another burst of blood. Again, she used her magic to dodge the liquid, and readied herself for the next ones. Then saw they were not coming. The ghoul was backing away, and the zombies were opening their mouths, inhaling air. Her eyes widened. "They're going to call for backup." She summoned spice to her hand to make the roars quiet, but saw it wouldn't be fast enough. No time for. A slime fell onto the ghoul backing away, and 2 bricks fell onto the 2 zombies, and all 3 monsters crumpled down from the impacts. Fayette looked up, and saw her friends, panting from exhaustion, but having caught up. Marie was readying another brick with her magic, and Mireille was putting away the bucket, switching to needles. Just in time. Giving them a quick nod, Fayette moved forward to give the downed monsters finishing blows to the head, and soon all that remained in the alleyway were 5 wide splotches of blood which covered it all in a slimy layer, every bit except the spot where Fayette was standing, and where the child was lying prone. "Excellent job cleaning up after your ward. Progress towards next level, 35%. Wait, that was a lot. I guess that counts as a new thing, and somewhat dangerous." The boy's eyes were wide, and he was staring at Fayette as if she was an angel straight out of heaven. Fayette quickly made sure she didn't have any blood on her outfit, then moved to the boy, giving him a hand. "Hey, are you all right?" The kid caught himself staring, blinked his eyes twice, then finally grabbed onto the hand and let Fayette pull him up right into a hug. Fayette froze as the boy buried his face into her apron, holding onto her with both hands. She couldn't quite make out what he was mumbling. Slowly, very slowly, she unfroze, and feeling very awkward, gave the kid a pat on the head. There, it's fine, the maid is here to save you." "Are you fine down there?" Marie asked, right in Fayette's ear, and the maid almost jumped until she remembered the lady had a skill for moving her voice where she wanted. Frowning, the maid kept patting the boy's head and looked up at the roof. She shrugged, not knowing what to say. "We'll be down in a bit," Mireille said, having procured a thick rope from somewhere. She began to affix it to the roof tiles. Fayette sighed, and looked down, noticing that the boy seemed to have quieted. "Hey, Kid. Can you be brave and tell me what's happened? Slowly, the boy unwrapped his arms from around her and took a step back. Surprisingly, his eyes didn't have any tears in them, and Fayette noted with shock and quite a bit of appreciation that he hadn't gotten her apron dirty. No, his eyes were shining as if he was looking at a hero. Boy, can you talk? He nodded silently, then caught himself, froze, and managed to stammer out a reply. Yes, miss. I can talk. I'm no kid. Fayette squinted at that, as he was rather short, coming up well below her neck, and noted that his clothes seemed to be a uniform she was rather familiar with, if one that was a bit grimy from a chase down some streets. That would make him 12 years old or so. Are you from an orphanage? The boy nodded, once again froze, then began talking in a sudden rush of words. Yes, orphanage, yes. We were all hidden in there, windows and doors boarded right shut until this all would get better, but the food was running out, even if the caretakers didn't say, because I saw how they gave their portions to us, so I snuck out, and then... Wait, Fayette said, motioning him to quiet with her hand. I get the picture now. You snuck out to find some food for everyone, then ended up being found by the nasty bad monsters. He froze again, seemingly realizing that he had rambled a bit, then sheepishly nodded. Yes. That's pretty much it. Fayette looked behind her and saw that Marie and Mireille had finally gotten down from the roof. Well, I guess this might be as fine a starting point as any. Hey, you two. I think I found our first spot of investigation. She turned back to the boy, then tapped her apron of holding very full of food as it always was. Do you remember the way back? What am I asking? Of course, you do. Let's go get some food to your friends. Just in case, she used a disarming smile on the kid. Feeding an orphanage under zombie siege? Fayette could just about smell the levels. Why is he making such an odd face? Am I not reassuring? Chapter 80 The Orphanage. So, boy, what's your name? Haley, miss. Right. Now, Haley, just hold onto my hand for a bit and I'll pull you up to the rooftop, like that. Feeling steady? The boy nodded. Fayette tightened her grip on his hand. Good. Now, make sure to keep quiet and watch your footing, will help you over any bigger gaps. The boy gave a determined nod, and Fayette finally let go, trusting him to manage the rest himself. Doesn't seem too shaken by the whole zombie chase situation he just went through. Is he just putting on a brave front, or does he genuinely not mind? The maid couldn't quite parse the boy's face, so she shrugged and turned to the others. Having climbed back to the rooftop ahead of her, they had watched Fayette guide the boy up, and now bore strange expressions. Especially Marie, who looked fascinated. What are you looking at? Fayette asked her, frowning. The lady blinked, finally realized she had been staring, then finally managed to stammer out a reply as her face colored. Oh. Sorry, it's just, seeing you manage a child is quite different to say the least. Fayette quirked an eyebrow. What did you expect? Probably you handling him like a hay bale, causing permanent trauma in the process, Mireille said, snorting. That was just one time, and we were all kids back then, Fayette replied, rolling her eyes. She looked back and bent down so her eyes met Haley's, and used another disarming smile. The kid flinched back. Is my smile really that odd? Haley, can you show which way the orphanage is? That way, miss, the darker building in front of the big spires. He replied, pointing at a building about 5 blocks away, standing in front of a church. It stood taller than the ones beside, making it visible even from this distance. Fayette nodded, then began marching forward, steps quiet. Let's go. Though first. She activated her monocyte and grimaced. It's gotten thicker. The miasma of nasty dark green mana had been barely visible on the outskirts, but just a bit deeper in the district, it suddenly became a lot thicker. And though she had a plague mask artifact counteracting it, Fayette turned and saw the miasma swirling around the unguarded boy. She frowned. It doesn't seem to get indoors as much, so his orphanage might be fine, but rummaging out like this can't be good for him. Hold still for a moment, Haley. The boy froze in surprise as Fayette removed her own plague mask, then bent down to fix it over the boy's face. There. Make sure you don't lose that, or I will be very cross. Haley gave the mask a reverent touch and nodded furiously, and Fayette rose up satisfied. Don't look at me like that, Miri, we'll only be out for a bit more. I didn't say anything, Mireille answered. Don't act like you weren't thinking it. Shaking her head, Mireille turned to the other edge of the roof, rope already in hand. Fayette prodded Haley with her broom, and once he started moving forward, followed along, Marie at her side. Her bucket of acid slime sloshed, but she wasn't too worried about the sound. The groaning of monsters just a bit below the roof covered it up. Almost too well. Suspicious, Fayette gave the lady walking by her side a nudge, noticing that she had her eyes focused forward like they were when she drew. Are you doing that? The lady jolted and the moans quieted for a bit, and she spoke in a hush. Control conversation. Keeps our talk silent, and I thought it could cover other noises this way too. Fayette nodded. Good thinking. There were all sorts of ways to use abilities if one really thought about it, and got creative. Flipping a fork in her hand idly as she walked, Fayette wondered what she could eventually make of that skill. That murder cook probably had some skills like that, but not my style really. Arriving at the edge, Mireille began to cast the rope over to the next rooftop, guiding it with threads and needles both. Fayette said a silent prayer for her sake too. She's trying all sorts of things too, and her next level up should be soon. Hopefully, it works out for her. They crossed the gap in silence. Traversing the rooftops was surprisingly easy once they all got the hang of it. The widest gaps they had to jump over were around 7 feet, which was trivialized with Mireille tying a rope to either end for balance. A few times they had to stop in place and wait for a larger group of zombies to pass by, but none bothered them this high up. At least not at this time. Fayette felt very aware of the sun shining down on her face. I wonder how different things get after nightfall. And though the danger wasn't too bad, Fayette felt worse and worse about the place the further into town they went. It wasn't just the increasing numbers of monsters, signs of decay, or even the many corpses lining the streets. No, the miasma of plague mana just kept getting thicker. Marie, are you feeling what I'm feeling? Fayette asked, eyeing a corpse on the street below that had a bouquet of flowers placed beside it. Did someone find time for that during all this? She looked up, meeting her friend's eyes, and saw them glowing with magic as the lady looked over the ambient mana. It wasn't just the air, the very ground seemed to be seeped with it here. Never seen the like of it before, Marie answered, peering around. It's just, everywhere. Mana usually has a distinct source, like the corpses and stains before, but this has struck so deep into the very earth. Fayette eyed the figure walking beside her, glad that the boy was wearing the mask now, even if it meant foregoing her own protection for a bit. Forget the zombies, this feels like it could infect just by presence alone. Let's hurry, I want to see what the conditions in the orphanage are like. They increased their pace for the last 2 rooftop crossings, passing over more corpses with flower bouquets by their sides and hordes of monsters that seemed to be growing in number by the second. But they passed unnoticed, not getting into any delays or trouble, and soon stood atop the last rooftop. They stared at a thickly boarded up grey building complex, which loomed among the shorter buildings like a giant coffin. This orphanage was very different from the one Fayette had once called home. This was not a former manor fallen into disrepair or any other repurposed building. It had clearly been built first and foremost to house as many as possible as tightly as possible. It wasn't wide, only taking the same space as the other buildings by its sides, but it was tall, and the denseness of its prison-like windows spoke of cramped rooms. But most of all, it was the drab greyish exterior that made Fayette shudder, and only tapping into her maid sense could she see why. Wait a minute, there's supposed to be reddish brick under there. Not that. What the heck? She couldn't help asking the question. Boy, is your building's facade never cleaned? Are your caretakers absolutely useless? He looked up at her, confused. What would be the use in that? It would get dirty all again from the smoke. Over there, Faye, Mireille said, sensing her friend's thoughts. She pointed at the factories, which had shifted position to the party's right side as they had moved. They're not active now, but I bet you when the furnaces are burning this side of town gets a healthy dose of smoke to enjoy. Fayette felt at the wind, and looking at the other buildings around, confirmed it. Every facade was marred by years of smoke, much worse than she had seen it even in Pelagny. Wait a minute, was this district this drab before this whole zombie situation? On some level, she had put the black coloration of the buildings as the plague's fault, but thinking things through more carefully, it couldn't be true. The outbreak hadn't lasted that long yet. She could recognize ingrained grime when she saw it. Well, that's depressing. But not our real issue now, is it? Kid, how are we supposed to get inside the building? I don't feel like breaking through all those windows your friends have so carefully worked to barricade. Over there, by the street level, the boy answered, pointing at a window low to the street. It looks boarded up, but actually it's very loose, and I managed to get it off. Will we fit through that little window there? She herself probably could, and Mireille too, now that she thought about it. That girl never did eat enough. As to Marie, Fayette gave her bosom a practiced side-eye, then chalked that one up to a maybe. I guess we can widen the gap if it becomes an issue. Her made sense, and I confirmed there shouldn't be any foes near their position at the moment, so Fayette nodded to herself and judged the timing good. I'll bring the rear. Marie, can you help Haley through? Quickly, they helped themselves to the street level with some of Mireille's ropes, then shuffled over the street to the window. Haley bent down and pulled the plank covering it up easily enough, then slipped through like a cat into a box. Marie followed him in, much less gracefully, falling in with a loud crash. Next went Mireille, and Fayette handed the girl her bucket and broom before taking a final look at the streets still clear and slipping through herself. Having to crawl on the dirty ground to reach the window made her grimace, but she managed it. Oh no, now my uniform's all dirty. Could have swept it all first? Scowling, she fixed the poorly attached plank back into place, and then with a thought, turned back to Mireille. Can you put something here to make this more secure? I don't think we should leave vulnerabilities. The seamstress gave her a curt nod and went to work, so Fayette turned to the other two. Marie was nursing her shoulder, apparently having barely evaded landing right on her head, while Haley next to her looked oddly nervous. It was an expression Fayette recognized well. Feeling guilty, are we? She asked, evoking her best impression of a strict caretaker's tone. The boy almost jumped, but seeing that it had been Fayette, relaxed a bit. He eyed the ground. I'm just worried about what they'll say. Naughty kids doing stuff they're not supposed to do really all look the same. Will my disarming smile work this time? She gave it her best shot. Don't worry, I'm sure everything will be fine. It did not work, and the boy seemed to only grow tenser, at least until Marie rose to her feet, stifling a giggle. That really does look odd on you. Fayette's skill-forced smile shifted as her natural scowl crept beneath it, resulting in a truly horrifying combination, which only sent the lady into more giggles. What, is my smile really that bad? Fayette asked, feeling oddly self-conscious. Does Marie not like it? It's not bad exactly, Mireille said, clapping Fayette on the shoulder. She gave her friend a sympathetic look. I think it's just that you use your smile muscles so little that they've all atrophied away. I'm pretty sure I saw one of the dead ones making that exact face. Fayette stopped smiling. Then I'm never doing it again. No, no, no. Marie said in a panic, waving her hands and stepping forward. If anything, that just means you have to smile more. Smile all the time. Practice. Fayette sighed, and then stealthily looked at the kid, and saw that his nerves seemed to have relaxed with the silly act. Good, was worth a try. Picking up her slime bucket, Fayette kicked the room's door out and started marching further in. Let's get this over with. Good job escorting a lost child home and consoling him. Progress towards next level, 45%. That counts? Now, when one was under zombie siege and had been hunkered away in a damp building for days on end without contact with outside humans, one might naturally be a bit startled by a maid suddenly stomping inside like a bull in a porcelain store. Most of the building had been empty and abandoned, showing little signs of recent life, so Fayette had managed to march through it quite a bit before she found people. And there were obstacles. Haley had neglected to mention that the boards covering the outer windows were just the first line of defense, and most doors leading further in had also been barred from the other side. Of course, the kid led them to a few less well-reinforced spots, and eventually to one which was too small for the adults to fit, forcing Fayette to return to the main route's barred door. It was time to batter obstacles down. Thud, thud, thud. Went the great oaken doors as Fayette battered them first with her ironwood broom, then her legs, and deeming it all inefficient, eventually used so fresh, so clean with a small charge to smash through. With a great blue flash and a crackle of wood, the big oaken door fell right off its hinges onto the ground, revealing the dining hall beyond. Fayette stepped over the door and stared at the occupants. They all stared back. 24 or so children, faces gaunt and jumpy, watched her with wide eyes from the far end of the room, where they were cowering in fear of the monster battering at the gates. 4 caretakers held pots, pans, and kitchen knives in their shaking arms, faces determined to face their foe until the very end, but seeing a maid be their intruder, all their weaponry clattered to the floor. Fayette scoffed at their weak hands. Amateurs. What if I had been a maid zombie? Shaking her head, she quickly took in the space's occupants, getting a picture of the overall situation. Bedrolls lined the walls, and flickering candles as well as a dim skylight lit the room. She didn't sense much plague mana within. Guess oak doors are a solution to many of life's problems. The scant few occupants within and the state of the outer rooms revealed that the orphanage hadn't been at full capacity for a good while, so Fayette could agree with the tactical value of gathering everyone into one room. Excuse me, but who? One of the caretakers finally began, still goggling at Fayette, but the maid just sighed. I don't want to deal with explanations. She looked back, then pointed at the caretakers. Mireille, take Haley along and handle them. The seamstress grimaced, but then marched past Fayette to the adults, dragging a now more reluctant Haley behind her. Fine, I'll do it. Hello there, sorry for the intrusion, we are. Issue 1 handled. Fayette turned away from the adults, to her real object of concern, the children who were no longer cowering at the back. With their intruders revealed to be mysterious strangers instead of hungry monsters, their eyes had turned curious. Like a dam bursting, a tide of children suddenly cascaded upon Fayette and the lady standing behind her. Who are you? Why are you here? What's it like outside? What is that uniform? Fayette again sighed, rubbed her forehead, and pushed a few children away from her. I'll never get any work done mobbed down like this. Looking behind her, she saw a very flustered Marie trying to get a word in against the children crowding her, and had an idea. Wasn't that last bunch of kids very interested in? She clapped her hands loudly, and instantly all attention was on her. Fayette gestured at herself, highlighting her outfit. Hello children, as you can see I have a uniform like this, therefore I am a maid. You all agree, right? The children stayed silent, and nodded, agreeing with her impeccable logic. Fayette smiled, deciding to show what her real smile was like, a lot more impish than the last one. Her eyes turned to Marie, who was watching her curiously. Fayette pointed. Now, as I am a maid, what would that make her? She is with me, and just look at how pretty she is. Isn't she obviously a lady? Marie blushed. Wait. Me, pretty? Are you say? And then her voice was drowned as the tide of children engulfed her, completely forgetting about Fayette. The girls in the group were practically frothing at the mouth at the chance to see a real lady, and the boys were shouting out questions, equally curious. Fayette smiled wider. Problem 2 solved. That will teach her. With that, she looked over the room again, quickly identifying what her duty in this situation would be. Mireille would question the adults, getting all usable information from them, while Marie would entertain the children, which left Fayette the most important job of all. She had seen how gaunt the kids had looked, and though they were trying to hide it, the caretakers looked quite skeletal too. Food must have run short days ago. Clapping her hands clean of any dust and getting some soap out of her apron, the maid marched into the kitchen, already pulling out ingredients from her apron. What she saw were pots and pans in rather good condition, if left unused due to the rather empty pantry. Fayette was impressed by having an actual stove to use. Last time I had to cook up a feast, I was in cave maid mode. Maybe this is why maids tend to stick with households, it does make things easier.